The courtroom was filled with a charged silence. The air felt thick with tension as the judge, his face set in grim determination, turned toward the gallery. Outside, the media was buzzing with the latest sensational headlines. The world was watching. Everyone was waiting for the revelation that would shake the very foundation of Hollywood's most legendary icon. Clint Eastwood. The name alone carried weight. A man whose films had shaped the very soul of action cinema. A man who had become synonymous with the American dream. Gritty, tough, and yet somehow, impossibly, heroic. He had spent decades perfecting his persona on screen and off-screen. He was seen as an untouchable figure, a man of mystery and strength. But now, the world was questioning everything. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "you stand accused of being a fraud. A man who has lived a life of deception, misleading the public and, more seriously, the government of the United States." The words stung like cold water in the dead of winter. Clint's gaze remained steady, but inside, a storm was brewing. He had always been able to control the narratives in his films, always been the one to decide how the story unfolded. But this time, there was no script, no rehearsals, only the cold, hard truth of the courtroom. The accusations were ridiculous, he thought. The public had always seen him as an untouchable figure, the ultimate symbol of American grit. How could they turn on him now, after all these years? But Clint knew better than anyone that the truth could be twisted, manipulated, and used against him. He'd seen it all before, on screen and in real life. The charges had come suddenly, like a storm that hit without warning. One moment, Clint was on top of the world, the epitome of success. The next, he was facing a courtroom full of strangers, all eager to tear him apart. He didn't know who had started the rumors, who had whispered the first word that turned into a wildfire. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The media had seized the story, and now, no one was safe from the fallout. His lawyer, a seasoned veteran with a face carved by years of dealing with high-profile cases, sat beside him, whispering quietly, "Clint, we need to focus on the facts. Don't let them get under your skin. We'll get through this." Clint didn't reply. His thoughts were elsewhere. He was too calm, too composed, for a man whose world had just been turned upside down. In fact, it was almost as if he had expected this moment, as if he had been waiting for it. His eyes shifted toward the gallery. Reporters, lawyers, spectators, and in the back, hidden in plain sight, was someone who made Clint's blood run cold. A man wearing a black suit, his face obscured by a pair of dark sunglasses, watching Clint with an intensity that made it feel as though the whole room had disappeared. Clint had seen men like that before, in places where secrets and shadows ran deeper than the truth. He had never imagined, not in a million years, that he'd be sitting here, in front of this audience, being labeled as something he wasn't. He could feel the eyes on him, judging him, scrutinizing every inch of his life. The court documents had painted him as a fraud, a man who had built his entire career on lies. But the truth, Clint knew, was far more complicated than anyone could imagine. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The words flashed through his mind. He had seen them before. It was a phrase, common in the media circus surrounding high-profile cases. It was almost like a call to action, a way to bring the audience into the story, to make them feel like they were part of the journey. Clint's eyes narrowed. The question seemed to mock him. What pushed him forward when things got tough? It wasn't the fame. It wasn't the accolades. It wasn't the movies. No, it was the quiet, invisible war he had been fighting for years. A war that no one knew about. A war that had made him who he was today. And now, it was threatening to unravel everything he had worked for. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the prosecutors stood and read through a list of accusations. They spoke of espionage, of covert operations, of a hidden life that Clint had supposedly been living all along. The name CIA was mentioned repeatedly, followed by words like spy and traitor. Clint's mind drifted back to a time long ago when he had made a choice that would forever bind him to a world of secrecy and danger. He remembered the early days, back before he became the icon everyone thought they knew. He had been approached by a man in a dark alley in Los Angeles, a man who had given him an offer he couldn't refuse. The CIA had needed someone like Clint, someone who could blend into the shadows, someone who could move unnoticed while pulling strings behind the scenes. He was the perfect candidate. Clint had never been a hero in the traditional sense, but he had always believed in one thing: protecting the people he loved, no matter the cost. And so, he had played his role. He had become the spy that no one knew, the man behind the curtain, making moves to protect the nation. But now, sitting in this courtroom, he could feel the weight of his choices. The world would never understand why he had done what he did. They would never know the sacrifices he had made for the greater good. And they certainly wouldn't understand the true nature of the world he had inhabited, the world that had turned him into the man standing before them today. The prosecutor's voice cut through his thoughts. Clint Eastwood, you stand accused of being an imposter, a fraud, a man who used his Hollywood fame as a cover for your real identity as a high-ranking CIA operative. The words felt like a slap in the face, but Clint remained silent. The truth was far more complicated than anyone could ever know. And as the courtroom waited for his response, Clint Eastwood's mind raced. He knew that his silence would only fuel the fire, but it was the only option he had. The world wasn't ready for the truth, and neither was he. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The weight of the courtroom was suffocating. Clint could feel it, even as he sat in silence. But the truth, his truth, wasn't something that could be told in one moment. It wasn't something anyone would understand with a quick glance. To truly understand Clint Eastwood, you had to know where he came from, what had shaped him into the man sitting in that courtroom today. Clint's life hadn't always been filled with the bright lights of Hollywood or the grandiosity of fame. He had grown up in a small town in California, far from the flashing cameras and glitzy movie sets. Born in San Francisco in 1930, Clint was the son of an accountant and a homemaker, two hardworking, ordinary people who lived in a modest neighborhood. It was a humble beginning, one that would shape his outlook on life and instill in him a fierce sense of independence. Growing up, Clint wasn't a troublemaker, but he wasn't exactly a perfect student either. He struggled in school, often getting into trouble for being too quiet, too withdrawn. But there was something in him, even at a young age, that refused to back down from a challenge. That spirit would carry him through his most difficult moments, whether he was battling a film director who doubted his abilities or facing the shadowy world of espionage that would one day consume his life. Clint had always been a man who thrived on challenges, and it was this drive that eventually brought him to the world of acting. It wasn't a love for the spotlight that pulled him in. It was the opportunity to become someone else, to live a life different from his own. And so, like so many others, he packed his bags and moved to Los Angeles, determined to make a name for himself. But even in Hollywood, Clint was no stranger to adversity. He struggled for years, taking odd jobs and small roles in TV shows, until he was cast in a Western series that would change his life forever. The show was Rawhide, and it marked the beginning of Clint's transformation into the man who would become known as the Man with No Name. It was here, on the set of Rawhide, that Clint's tough guy persona first began to take root. Hollywood, with all its glamour and allure, was a far cry from the world Clint had known growing up. But he adapted, and soon, the tough, rugged image that had initially been a part of his on-screen persona bled into his real life. Clint Eastwood became more than just an actor. He became an icon. He was a symbol of strength, resilience, and rugged masculinity. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of movie studios, who began casting him in roles that would cement his place in history. But as his career took off, Clint's life became increasingly complex. He found himself caught between the world of stardom and the call of something far darker and more dangerous. In the early 1960s, after the success of A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, Clint was offered a role that would forever change the trajectory of his life. A mysterious man approached him, someone with connections in high places, someone who understood the value of Clint's unique skills. This man worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. At first, Clint had been skeptical. He was a Hollywood actor, after all. The idea that he could be of any use to the government seemed absurd. But the offer was too intriguing to ignore. He was promised a chance to be involved in something far greater than the movies. This wasn't about fame. This was about serving his country in a way few people ever would. The CIA wanted him to be more than just an actor. They needed someone who could operate under the radar. Someone with the ability to blend into any situation, to become invisible when necessary. And Clint, with his stoic demeanor and rugged charm, was the perfect candidate. He agreed. It wasn't a decision he made lightly, but deep down, Clint knew he was already living a lie. Hollywood had taught him that nothing was ever as it seemed. And so, behind the scenes, he stepped into a new life, one that would remain hidden from the public for decades. Over the years, Clint found himself becoming more deeply involved in covert operations. He worked on missions that spanned the globe, missions that would make the headlines if they were ever exposed. But Clint wasn't in it for the glory or the recognition. He did it because, at the core, he believed in protecting the people he loved. And when you're in the CIA, loyalty means everything. As his film career continued to soar, Clint's involvement in the CIA deepened. He became an integral part of some of the agency's most important operations, often working behind the scenes while maintaining his public image as the tough, silent cowboy. Few people knew the true Clint Eastwood, the man who could bring down an international crime syndicate just as easily as he could ride a horse into a dusty sunset. But the more Clint worked with the CIA, the more complicated his life became. The lies piled up, and the secrets he kept weighed heavier on his conscience. He kept his family in the dark about his true work. His relationships with those closest to him, his wife, his children, his friends, became strained. How could he explain to them the dangerous world he was a part of? How could he justify the choices he made, the lies he had to tell to protect them? His public life, as an actor and director, continued to shine, while his private life became a maze of secrets. And it wasn't just his family that had no idea. The entire world was oblivious to the fact that Clint Eastwood, the icon they all adored, was also one of the most highly placed officials within the CIA. But now, everything was about to come crashing down. The court case, the accusations, the whispers. Clint was no longer in control of his own story. The world was finally beginning to question who he really was. The perfect image of Clint Eastwood, the hero, was unraveling. The man who had been a symbol of strength for so long was now facing the greatest challenge of his life. The stakes had never been higher, and the road ahead was uncertain. The days following Clint's appearance in court were a blur of headlines and sensational rumors. The media had seized the opportunity to tear into Clint's carefully curated image, labeling him everything from a traitor to a Hollywood puppet. Every day, there seemed to be a new story, some wild accusation, some new evidence that painted Clint in a darker light. But Clint had been in the public eye long enough to know that the truth often didn't matter when the storm of public opinion was raging. What mattered now was surviving the onslaught. His lawyer, Mark Whitfield, a tall, well-dressed man with sharp eyes, had spent the past few days working tirelessly to navigate the mess Clint found himself in. Mark had handled high-profile cases before, but this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The stakes were personal. There was more at play here than just clearing Clint's name. "We need to focus on what we can prove," Mark said, his voice low and steady, as Clint sat across from him in the cramped office. "You can't fight rumors with more rumors. We need to stick to the facts. We'll prove that you're not who they say you are." Clint didn't respond immediately. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the moments in court when those words, fraud, imposter, traitor, had been thrown at him. The accusations had stung, but the truth of the matter was far more complicated. Clint wasn't some average actor who had stumbled into the CIA. No, his involvement ran much deeper than that. He was no pawn, but the situation was dire. "I don't care about the rumors," Clint finally said, his gravelly voice thick with conviction. "What I care about is the people who are behind this. Someone's trying to take me down. Someone with a reason. A reason they don't want the world to know." Mark looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed. "You're saying this is a setup?" Clint's piercing blue eyes locked onto his lawyer. "It's bigger than that. This isn't just about me. There's something else going on here. Someone wants to expose me, and by doing so, they want to expose everything I've been a part of. All of it. The CIA, the covert operations, the lies. The real Clint Eastwood. Mark sat back in his chair, considering Clint's words. And you think this is connected to your work with the CIA? Clint didn't hesitate. I know it is. For years, Clint had operated in the shadows, his actions concealed behind a wall of secrecy. The CIA had always demanded discretion, always insisted on confidentiality. But now, someone had found a way to pierce that wall. Whoever was behind this knew far too much about his life. They knew things that only a handful of people in the world could know. The more Clint thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a simple courtroom case. This was about exposing a network of secrets, about taking down the very organization Clint had been a part of for decades. And if he didn't act fast, they would use him as a pawn in a game that could destroy everything he had built. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding Clint's trial only intensified. News outlets from across the globe ran with the story, each one adding fuel to the fire. They painted Clint as a liar, a fraud, someone who had manipulated the public for decades. The public, always eager for scandal, lapped it up. Social media exploded with hashtags like #EastwoodExposed and #CIA-Clint. Even Clint's closest friends and allies were beginning to doubt him. He had spent his life building an image, crafting a persona that was larger than life, and now it was all coming crashing down. The man who had once been a symbol of strength and integrity was now being questioned at every turn. But the worst part? He couldn't prove them wrong, at least, not yet. And then, there were the whispers, the ones Clint couldn't ignore. They spoke of someone within the CIA who was playing a dangerous game, someone who had turned against him, someone who wanted to take down the entire operation, not just Clint. The more Clint thought about it, the more it made sense. The government had always been a world of complex alliances and betrayals. People didn't always act out of loyalty. Sometimes, they acted out of personal vendettas, hidden motives, or the desire for power. Clint had seen it firsthand in his years with the CIA. And now, someone was using the public's trust in him to take a shot at that world. Clint's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications of what he was dealing with. If someone within the CIA was pulling the strings behind this, it would mean a much bigger conspiracy, one that could bring the entire agency down. He couldn't let that happen, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of the people who had trusted him, the people who had fought alongside him for years. The clock was ticking. Clint knew that time was running out, and every move he made from this point forward would either make or break his future. He needed to find the source of the leak, fast. He needed to uncover the person who was behind this smear campaign before they could do any more damage. But as Clint's mind raced, he couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. Whoever was behind this wasn't just going after him. They were going after the very core of everything he had fought for. And that meant the stakes were much higher than he had ever imagined. As the sun began to set, casting a long shadow over the streets of Los Angeles, Clint made a decision. He would go on the offensive. He would find out who was responsible for this, and he would take them down. There would be no more hiding, no more playing by the rules. It was time for Clint Eastwood to stop being the man who followed orders and start being the man who made them. Clint Eastwood sat in his car, the engine idling in the parking garage beneath a nondescript building in downtown Los Angeles. The rain drummed lightly against the windshield, the rhythmic tapping a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. This wasn't just about his career or public image anymore. It was about something far more dangerous. Someone had gone to great lengths to expose him. But why? And who was pulling the strings? His eyes narrowed as he glanced at the faded address on the piece of paper in his hand. The location was no coincidence. It was a safe house, a place where CIA operatives had gone for refuge or to meet in secret. Clint had used it himself years ago, in the midst of operations that needed to stay off the grid. But now, it seemed more like a place to confront the past he had spent so long hiding. With a heavy sigh, Clint pushed open the car door and stepped out into the cold. The garage was quiet, almost eerily so, and the only sounds were the faint hum of the city and the distant rumble of thunder. He made his way toward the entrance of the building, each step more determined than the last. This wasn't just a mission, it was personal. Clint knew the risks. The CIA had long been known for its web of secrets, and he was now stepping into the heart of it. Someone on the inside was leaking information, and Clint was convinced that this was more than just a smear campaign. The leak wasn't just targeting him. It was targeting everything the CIA had worked for. And it seemed there was only one person who could explain it all, the person Clint had been avoiding for years, Raymond Hensley. Hensley was a former CIA operative, a man who had once been a mentor to Clint during his early days with the agency. But after a mission gone wrong, Hensley had disappeared from the agency's radar. Rumors swirled that he had gone rogue, betraying the very organization that had once been his life. No one knew where he had gone, and no one dared to speak his name. But Clint had always suspected that Hensley knew more than anyone about the dark side of the CIA. Secrets that could bring it all crashing down. As Clint stepped into the building's elevator, he felt the familiar weight of the mission settle on his shoulders. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, and the line between friend and foe was blurred. The elevator ascended, its slow hum a reminder that time was running out. As the doors opened, Clint found himself facing a hallway lit only by the dim glow of fluorescent lights. He took a deep breath, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, and stopped in front of a door marked with a simple number, 402. He knocked once, twice. A long pause followed, before the sound of footsteps on the other side broke the silence. The door swung open, revealing a man Clint hadn't seen in years. Raymond Hensley was older now, grayer, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But Clint recognized him immediately, the same sharp, calculating gaze that had once trained him in the ways of covert operations. Hensley's presence was unsettling, like a shadow that refused to be shaken. Clint didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You know why I'm here." Hensley studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether to let Clint in or turn him away. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in. We don't have much time." The room was sparse, furniture consisting only of a small table, a few chairs, and a single lamp casting a dim light on the walls. It felt like a place meant for secrecy, for conversations that couldn't take place anywhere else. Hensley motioned for Clint to sit, and Clint complied, his eyes scanning the room. He noticed a file on the table, its contents deliberately obscured. Whatever Hensley was hiding, it was more than just a few dusty papers. "Someone's been leaking information," Clint said, his voice steady. "About me, about my past. And I know you're the only one who can tell me who's behind it." Hensley's face hardened, and for a moment, Clint thought he might not speak. But then, slowly, he sat down opposite Clint. His eyes flickered with the weight of years of secrets, of guilt, of betrayal. "The leak isn't just about you, Clint," Hensley said, his voice low. "It's about something much bigger. Someone within the agency is trying to take it down. They've been feeding the media lies, yes, but they've also been trying to disrupt our operations. They've been trying to tear down the system from the inside." Clint leaned forward, his heart racing. "Who?" Hensley hesitated, then dropped his gaze to the table. "I can't tell you yet, but I can tell you this. It's someone high up. Someone with enough power to control the narrative, to shift the direction of the agency. Whoever is behind this, Clint, they're playing a long game. And if we don't stop them, everything we've worked for will be destroyed." The revelation hit Clint like a punch to the gut. A rogue element within the CIA wasn't just a threat. It was a cancer, slowly eroding the agency's integrity from the inside out. And Clint had unknowingly been swept up in the chaos. Clint's jaw tightened. He had spent his career protecting people, fighting for justice. Now, he had to fight to save the very organization he had once sworn to serve. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but Clint wasn't a man to shy away from a fight. He had faced down countless enemies, and he wasn't about to back down now. "How do we stop them?" Clint asked, his voice determined. Hensley glanced at the file on the table. "We need to find the source. But more importantly, we need to expose them before they can take us down. You can't do it alone, Clint. This is bigger than you, than me. You need to trust someone." Clint's mind raced, And as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place, he knew one thing for certain. The journey ahead would be unlike anything he had ever faced. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about uncovering a hidden network, one that could bring the CIA to its knees. And Clint Eastwood, the man with no name, was about to take on the most dangerous mission of his life. The tension in the small room was palpable. Clint sat across from Raymond Hensley, each of them wrapped in the weight of the conversation that had just unfolded. The revelation that the CIA itself was being dismantled from within was too much to bear. There were still so many questions, and Clint needed answers before he could proceed. But those answers didn't come easily. Clint's mind raced as he thought back to the years he had spent working in the shadows, taking down enemies one by one, always with the knowledge that he was serving a greater cause. Now, that cause seemed to be unraveling before him. "I thought we were the good guys," Clint muttered, his voice hoarse, as if the words were a confession. "We used to stand for something." Hensley's eyes softened, the hardened exterior he had worn for years slipping just enough for Clint to see the man beneath the layers of secrecy. "We did. But times change. People change. The agency I knew, the one you knew, no longer exists. There's no honor in what's going on now, Clint. It's a power play, and you've been caught in the middle of it." Clint's eyes narrowed. Who's pulling the strings? Who's orchestrating all of this? Hensley took a deep breath and reached for the file on the table. He hesitated, then opened it slowly, revealing a series of photos, documents, and encrypted messages. The papers were all marked with the same cryptic code that Clint had seen used in the most classified operations. Clint leaned in closer. As his eyes scanned the contents, the weight of the situation hit him harder than ever. There, staring back at him from one of the photographs, was a familiar face. Victor Ames. Ames was an old colleague from Clint's early days in the CIA, an ambitious, highly skilled operative who had quickly risen through the ranks. They had worked together on several covert missions, and Clint had always admired Ames' sharp mind and ability to think several steps ahead. But what Clint had never known, what he could never have guessed, was that Ames had been playing a different game all along. "You've got to be kidding me," Clint muttered, shaking his head. "Victor Ames? How could he be involved in this?" Hensley's gaze remained fixed on Clint, the gravity of the situation clear in his eyes. "You didn't know, but Ames has been grooming himself for something bigger. He's been feeding information to the highest bidder. He's not just trying to take down the CIA, he's trying to control it. And he's been using you, Clint, as a pawn in his game." Clint's fists clenched. The man who had once been his trusted colleague had become a traitor, and that betrayal hit harder than anything Clint had ever experienced. It wasn't just the personal betrayal. It was the realization that everything Clint had worked for, everything he had fought for, had been manipulated for someone else's gain. "This isn't just about me," Clint said, his voice cold now, tinged with the bitterness of truth. "This is about the CIA, about everything we've worked for. He's not just trying to ruin me. He's trying to take down the entire system." Hensley nodded grimly. "Exactly. Ames has spent years gaining power from within. He's playing a game where he's always 5 steps ahead. And now, he's using the leaks to create chaos, to destroy the agency's credibility. Once the public turns on the CIA, he can swoop in and take control. But it won't stop there. He has plans to sell the agency's secrets to the highest bidder, and that could mean disaster for national security." Clint's mind spun with the implications. Ames was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just a rogue agent. He was an enemy of everything Clint had fought for. This wasn't just about saving his own name anymore. It was about protecting the very institution that had shaped his life, the agency that had once been a beacon of order in a chaotic world. As Clint's eyes settled back on the file, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A list of names. The first few were familiar. CIA operatives who had worked with Clint on various missions, but then came a series of unfamiliar names. Names of politicians, foreign agents, and powerful businessmen. The connections were everywhere. Ames wasn't just targeting the CIA, he was targeting everything. "Who else is involved?" Clint asked, his voice tight with anger. "Who's working with him?" Hensley looked at Clint, a grim look on his face. "You need to understand, Clint. It's not just Ames. It's a network. And it's bigger than you think. People in power, people with money, they've all been feeding off the same system. Ames has been using the chaos he's caused to align himself with these people. He's no longer working alone. The truth hit Clint like a freight train. The weight of the conspiracy was massive. The CIA, the people Clint had once trusted, were now part of a web of deceit and manipulation. The people at the top of the ladder, the ones who had orchestrated this entire charade, were using Clint as a pawn to bring down the agency he had devoted his life to. As the pieces clicked into place, Clint's thoughts turned to action. He couldn't let Ames win. He couldn't let the system crumble. And he couldn't do it alone. Hensley's voice broke through Clint's thoughts. You're going to need allies, Clint. You can't take this on by yourself. Clint looked up at Hensley, his jaw set in determination. I don't care who I have to bring down. Ames is going to pay. And I'm going to make sure the CIA survives this. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air, but Clint's resolve was clear. This wasn't just about his reputation anymore. It was about saving everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. He wasn't going to let a traitor like Ames destroy it all. With the truth now laid bare before him, Clint understood that the road ahead would be the hardest of his life. He would need to dig deep, face enemies he never thought he'd have to confront, and navigate a world that had become a labyrinth of lies. But Clint Eastwood had always been a man who thrived in the chaos of battle. And now, the fight for the future of the CIA had begun. Clint Eastwood's hands were shaking as he left Hensley's hideout. The weight of the truth had hit him harder than he expected. Victor Ames, the man he once trusted as a colleague, was the very enemy Clint had been trying to protect the CIA from. But it wasn't just Ames who was behind this conspiracy. It was a network of powerful people, operating in the shadows, using Clint as a pawn in their game. The sky was darkening as Clint made his way through the narrow alley behind the building. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Every move now mattered. The war wasn't just about winning the public's trust. It was about taking down a powerful enemy from the inside. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. Clint pulled it out and checked the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. Don't trust Raymond. He's playing you. Come alone to the drop zone at midnight. I'll tell you everything. Clint's heart skipped a beat. It could only mean one person, Victor Ames. The message was a trap, but there was something in it that Clint couldn't ignore. Ames was playing his cards close to his chest. But why was he reaching out now, and why this way? Clint's instincts told him that this wasn't just a chance to confront Ames. It was an opportunity to gain intel that could turn the tables. He wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. As Clint made his way to the car, he replayed Hensley's words in his head. You can't do this alone. It was a hard pill to swallow, but Clint knew Hensley was right. He couldn't trust anyone, not completely, but he needed help. The CIA was a web of secrets, and if Clint was going to untangle it, he would need someone who could help him navigate the mess. He called an old contact, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Lisa Calloway, an expert hacker who had once worked with him on a high-profile operation. She was brilliant, resourceful, and had a reputation for getting things done under pressure. Clint. Lisa's voice was sharp on the other end. What's going on? I heard about the leaks. You in some deep trouble? I need you, Lisa, Clint said, his voice low. I'm going after Ames. I've got a lead, but I need someone to get me into the CIA's secure network. I need to know everything he's been involved in. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that told Clint she was weighing her options. Are you sure about this, Clint? She asked, her voice softer now. Ames? You're talking about one of your own. This could be dangerous, even for you. Clint's mind flashed back to the photograph of Ames, the smile on his face a stark contrast to the treachery in his heart. I know, but if we don't stop him, we're all done. I don't know who else to trust right now, but I do know you've got the skills we need. Lisa sighed. All right, I'll help, but we're doing this my way. No second chances. Clint smiled grimly. Deal. As he hung up, he felt a small sense of relief. Lisa wasn't just a hacker. She was one of the few people Clint knew he could rely on when everything else was falling apart. Now, all he had to do was survive the meeting with Ames. It was a dangerous game, But Clint was no stranger to danger. The drop zone was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, nestled deep in an industrial park. The clock on Clint's dashboard blinked 11:45 p.m. as he pulled up to the entrance, his headlights illuminating the desolate scene. There was no sign of Ames yet, but Clint wasn't fool enough to think he would show up on time. Ames was never the kind of man to make things easy. Clint parked his car a few yards away from the warehouse, cutting the engine and stepping out into the night air. The place was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of cars, no signs of movement. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark and abandoned, the rusted metal exterior a reminder of its long-forgotten purpose. Clint moved swiftly, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. His eyes scanned the surroundings, every instinct on high alert. As he approached the door, he was ready for anything. But still, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Clint turned toward the noise, his heart racing. The silhouette of a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakable. It was Ames. But something wasn't right. Clint could tell by the way Ames moved that he wasn't here for a simple confrontation. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension, as if the entire situation was one big game, and Clint had just walked into the final round. Ames stopped a few feet away from Clint, his expression unreadable. "I see you got my message," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of malice. "I'm not here to play your games, Ames," Clint replied, his tone steady. "I know what you're up to. I know about the leaks, the power play. It's over." Ames chuckled, the sound hollow and devoid of humor. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just waltz in here and take me down? You've been chasing ghosts, Clint. The truth is, you don't even know who you're really up against." Clint's pulse quickened. Ames wasn't acting like a man who was cornered. He was taunting Clint, trying to get into his head. But Clint wasn't falling for it. Not this time. "I'm not here to talk, Ames. I'm here to end this," Clint said, his eyes narrowing. "You're done." Ames smiled, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. "You've got it all wrong, Clint. It's you who's done. You're the one who's been manipulated. I'm not your enemy. You just don't see it yet." Clint's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, but just as he was about to take a step forward, the sound of sirens cut through the silence. A convoy of black SUVs screeched to a halt behind Clint, their headlights blinding in the darkness. Ames's smile grew wider. "I told you, Clint. You're playing in a league much bigger than you. Now, the real game begins." The trap had been set. Clint's heart raced as he stood face to face with Ames, the enemy he had been hunting for weeks. The sight of the black SUVs pulling up behind him filled Clint with a sense of urgency. Every instinct screamed that he was running out of time. Ames's mocking smile only fueled Clint's determination. He wasn't about to let this man get the best of him, not when the stakes had risen higher than ever. "Let's get this over with," Clint said, his voice steady, but his mind calculating every move. He wasn't about to let Ames manipulate him any longer. Before Ames could respond, two men in tactical gear stepped out of the SUVs, their hands resting on their weapons. Clint didn't flinch. He'd been in situations like this before, but something about the way Ames was orchestrating this encounter felt different. There was a darkness to it, a premeditated coldness that made Clint uneasy. "You think you can just walk away from this, Clint?" Ames said, his voice now low and serious. "I warned you. This is bigger than you. The game you've been playing with the CIA? It's already over." Clint clenched his jaw, fighting the anger rising inside him. "You're wrong. It's not over. It's just beginning." The men in tactical gear moved toward Clint, but he didn't move. He wasn't about to let them take him in without a fight. If they wanted him, they would have to work for it. Suddenly, Clint's phone buzzed again. He ignored the message at first, his focus on Ames and the men surrounding him. But then the phone buzzed again, more urgently this time. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, eyes flicking to the screen. It was from Lisa. "Clint, the data I pulled? It's worse than we thought. Ames has ties to everyone. Senators, military officials, intelligence networks. He's not just aiming for the CIA, Clint. He's trying to control the entire intelligence apparatus." Clint's stomach twisted. The implications were horrifying. Ames wasn't just a rogue agent. He was orchestrating something far larger than Clint had ever imagined. A network that stretched across the government, military, and even foreign intelligence agencies. This was no longer about saving the CIA. This was about saving the entire system. Clint looked up at Ames, his expression hardening. You think you've won? You think you can control everything? This isn't just about you, Ames. This is about every man and woman who's ever served this country. Ames's expression flickered, but only for a second. His confidence returned almost immediately, but it wasn't the arrogance Clint had seen before. There was something colder, more calculated in his eyes. You've never understood the game, Clint. You've been following orders your entire life. But you're not in control. You never were. Clint's muscles tensed as the men closed in on him. He couldn't let them take him. Not now. Not when he was so close to exposing the full extent of Ames's treachery. But Clint was a seasoned operative. He wasn't going to be caught off guard. The first man lunged at him, but Clint sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The second man took a swing at Clint, but he blocked the punch and quickly kicked the man's legs out from under him. The third man hesitated, unsure if he should act, but that hesitation was enough for Clint to take control of the situation. Before the third man could make his move, Clint had the man in a headlock, forcing him to the ground. The rest of Ames's men were disoriented, giving Clint the moment he needed. He drew his gun and pointed it directly at Ames. "You're finished, Ames," Clint said, his voice hard and final. "You're not walking away from this." Ames's smile disappeared, replaced with a look of cold calculation. "You really think you have the upper hand, don't you?" Clint didn't answer. He kept his focus on Ames, making sure the situation didn't slip out of his control again. Just as Clint was about to make his next move, a sudden crash rang out. Clint's attention snapped to the side just in time to see a black van screeching to a halt beside him. Before he could react, the side door of the van flew open, and several armed men stormed out, surrounding him from every angle. Clint's heart sank. This wasn't just a small operation anymore. Ames had an army at his disposal, and now it seemed like Clint was completely surrounded. But Clint wasn't going to back down. As the men closed in, he made a split-second decision. He didn't have time to fight them all off. Not like this. He needed to escape, to get back to Lisa and get the intel she had uncovered. There was only one way out. Clint threw his gun to the ground, raising his hands in surrender. His mind was already racing, calculating his next move. Ames's eyes narrowed, his suspicion evident. "What are you playing at, Clint? You think this is going to save you?" Clint maintained his calm exterior, knowing that the moment Ames underestimated him was the moment he'd strike. "I'm not playing at anything, Ames. You've lost." Ames gestured to his men, and they moved in to take Clint down. But just as they closed in, the sound of a car engine revving pierced the air. The van that had arrived with the reinforcements exploded into flames as a high-powered rifle shot rang out, followed by the screeching of tires. Clint's eyes snapped open in surprise as the van erupted in a massive fireball, throwing everyone to the ground. The explosion knocked the attackers off their feet, and in the chaos, Clint seized his chance. He rolled to the side, grabbing his gun and firing a few quick shots. The remaining attackers scattered, but Clint didn't hesitate. He darted for cover, his mind set on survival. Through the smoke and debris, Clint saw Lisa standing by the car, holding a rifle. She had saved him, again. "Get in," she shouted, urgency in her voice. Clint didn't need to be told twice. He dashed to the car, sliding into the passenger seat as Lisa slammed the gas pedal, speeding away from the wreckage. As the city lights flickered in the rearview mirror, Clint allowed himself a moment of relief. But the relief was fleeting. He knew this was only the beginning. Ames was a much bigger threat than he had ever imagined, and the fight was far from over. "You okay?" Lisa asked, glancing at him briefly. Clint exhaled, his mind still racing. "Yeah, for now. But we need to figure out what Ames is really after. And we need to stop him." Lisa nodded. "I've been digging. And Clint, you're not going to like what I found." The night felt like it was closing in around Clint as the car tore down the empty highway. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one darker than the last. Ames was playing a far deeper game than Clint had realized. The revelation that he was not just a rogue agent, but part of an entire global web of influence was almost too much to process. But Clint didn't have the luxury of time to dwell on the enormity of the situation. Beside him, Lisa's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white under the strain. They had barely spoken since the explosion. Neither of them had the words. Both knew that the night was far from over. "Where to now?" Clint asked, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We need to get to my safe house," Lisa replied, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "We'll be off the radar there for a bit. We need to plan our next move." Clint nodded. He trusted Lisa, always had. But trust wasn't something he took lightly anymore. After everything that had happened, after realizing how deep the betrayal ran, Clint couldn't afford to let his guard down. Even with Lisa, the one person who had consistently had his back, there was a lingering doubt. After all, everyone had their secrets. Ames had played Clint for a fool for so long. Could Lisa be playing him, too? His thoughts were interrupted by the piercing sound of his phone ringing. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. His hand hesitated over it for a moment, unsure if he should answer. But curiosity won out. He swiped the screen to pick up the call. "Clint Eastwood," he answered, his voice flat and guarded. The voice on the other end was low, familiar, but twisted. It was Ames. "Clint, we need to talk. You've got questions, and I have answers. Meet me at the old pier by 3 a.m. No one else. Just you. If you want to save the people you love, you'll come alone." Ames's words hung in the air like a threat, the cold finality in his tone sending a chill down Clint's spine. Clint didn't respond immediately. He glanced over at Lisa, who was focused on the road, her face unreadable. She didn't need to ask. She knew who was on the line. "You're not going alone," Lisa said firmly, her eyes never leaving the road. "This is a trap, Clint. You can't trust him." "I have to," Clint replied, his voice steady despite the unease swirling inside him. "I need to know what he's really after. If there's even a sliver of truth in what he said, then this could be our only chance to figure it out. I'm not leaving without answers." Lisa shot him a sharp look, but Clint held her gaze, his expression resolute. "You really think this is the only way?" she pressed. Clint exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He had no illusions about the danger. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap, that Ames had been playing him all along. But this was the only lead they had. If Ames was going to give up any information, Clint had to take the chance. "I don't have a choice," Clint said, "but I won't be going in blind. I'll have backup. I'll have you cover me from a distance, and I'll keep my guard up. Ames won't be able to pull this off if I'm prepared." Lisa gave him a long, searching look, her fingers tightening around the wheel before she sighed. "I can't stop you, but I'm coming with you, no matter what. Just let me do things my way. I'll keep the comms open." Clint nodded, grateful for her unwavering loyalty. "Deal." The pier was eerily quiet when they arrived, the only sound the faint lapping of waves against the posts. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an unnatural glow over the desolate landscape. Clint parked the car in a secluded area, his eyes scanning the dark, deserted pier. Everything about this place felt wrong. There were no lights, no signs of life. Only the ominous creaking of the abandoned structures as the wind picked up. Clint's grip tightened around his gun as he stepped out of the car, his senses on high alert. He didn't trust Ames for a second, and he knew that any mistake could cost him everything. "Remember," Lisa's voice crackled through his earpiece, "I've got eyes on the entire area. If you need me, I'm just a call away. Don't take any unnecessary risks." Clint nodded, though she couldn't see him. Understood. He approached the pier cautiously, his steps measured. There was a rustling sound from behind one of the rusted metal shipping containers, but it was just the wind. Clint was trying to calm his nerves, but every fiber of his being told him that this was a trap, a big one. Then, from the shadows, Ames emerged. He was alone, standing under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. The sight of him sent a rush of anger through Clint, but he kept his face neutral, not allowing his emotions to show. "I knew you'd come, Clint," Ames said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "You've always been predictable." "I'm done with your games, Ames," Clint growled, his gun still holstered but his hand poised over it. "What do you want?" Ames smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew they had the upper hand. "You really don't get it, do you? All this time, you've been playing right into my hands. You think you're stopping me? You think you're saving anyone? You've already lost." Clint's chest tightened with anger. "You're insane. What is it that you want? Power? Control?" Ames chuckled darkly. "It's much bigger than that. I'm offering you the chance to be part of something that can reshape the world. You've always been loyal to your country, Clint. But your country, it's corrupt. It's weak. I'm offering you a chance to be on the winning side." Clint took a step forward, his voice low but with a quiet fury. "I'm already on the winning side, Ames. I fight for the people who can't fight for themselves. You, on the other hand, are just a coward hiding behind your power." Ames's expression faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "You'll understand eventually. The world is changing, Clint, and you're either going to be left behind or you're going to be part of the future." Clint felt the weight of Ames's words, but they didn't sway him. He had heard enough. "This ends tonight, Ames." Before Ames could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind Clint. A group of men, heavily armed, emerged from the shadows, surrounding him in an instant. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for his gun, but it was too late. Ames smirked, his voice soft but chilling. "You should have listened, Clint. I tried to warn you." Clint's heart raced, and his mind screamed at him to act quickly. Surrounded by Ames's men, his back against the wall, every muscle in his body was poised for the fight of his life. He wasn't a stranger to danger, but something about this moment felt different. The trap was set, the stakes higher than ever. He'd walked into this situation with the belief that he could control it, but now that illusion was shattered. Ames had him right where he wanted him. The men encircling Clint were heavily armed, their eyes cold with the same relentless determination that Ames had shown. But Clint's mind was still clear, and his resolve was ironclad. He had to survive. For Lisa, for the truth, for everything he'd fought for. Ames, standing just a few feet away, watched Clint with an expression of cold amusement, like a predator watching its prey squirm before the kill. He was enjoying this moment, savoring Clint's struggle. "You still don't get it, do you?" Ames's voice cut through the air, smooth and taunting. "You've always been one step behind. You think you can stop me, but I've already won." Clint's eyes narrowed. His fingers brushed over the hilt of his gun, but he knew there was no easy escape from this. This wasn't just about outgunning Ames's men. It was about breaking free from the web Ames had spun, his network of power, lies, and manipulation that extended far beyond the CIA. "Your game is over, Ames," Clint replied, keeping his voice even, trying to show the confidence he was barely feeling. "I'm not afraid of you." Ames tilted his head, smirking. "You should be." He waved his hand dismissively, signaling his men to move closer. "Kill him. We don't need him anymore." Clint didn't hesitate. In the split second before the first man could reach him, Clint acted with lethal precision. He ducked, rolled to the side, and in one fluid motion, grabbed a fallen gun from the ground. He fired 3 shots in quick succession, each one finding its target with brutal accuracy. 2 of Ames's men dropped immediately, and the third hesitated, giving Clint just enough time to get to his feet. But Ames's forces were relentless. They moved in closer, faster, and Clint realized that he was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. "Clint, get out of there." Lisa's voice crackled in his earpiece, a tinge of panic in her voice. "There's too many of them. You have to move now." Clint's mind raced. He couldn't let Lisa's warning go unanswered. He needed a way out. But as he turned to scan his surroundings, something clicked. The pier. It wasn't just a trap, it was a setup. Ames had orchestrated every detail. The entire area had been designed to force Clint into a corner. But there was one way out. He had to take the fight to them. Clint fired off a few more shots, making the remaining men take cover behind the rusted pier supports. It was the distraction he needed. He ran to his left, ducking behind a nearby stack of old crates, his heart pounding in his chest. His muscles burned from the adrenaline coursing through him, but he had to keep moving. "Clint," Lisa's voice came through again, sharp with concern. "You've got to keep moving. The reinforcements are on their way. I've got your back, but you need to get out now." He knew she was right. Reinforcements were closing in fast. He had to finish this, and he had to finish it now. Clint's eyes darted to the edge of the pier, where a boat was tied up, bobbing gently on the water. It was small, a two-person skiff, but it was the only option he had. He knew it wouldn't take him far, but it would get him away from this nightmare, at least for a few hours. Taking a deep breath, Clint sprinted toward the boat, but before he could reach it, a shot rang out. He felt the sting of something grazing his shoulder, a burning sensation that made his body jerk in pain. But Clint didn't stop. He couldn't stop. With one final burst of energy, he reached the boat and untied it in one smooth motion. The small engine sputtered to life as Clint pushed off the dock, his eyes scanning the water for any signs of Ames's men. As the boat gained speed, Clint exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of the night lift slightly off his chest. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the boat cut through the dark waters, Clint allowed himself a moment to collect his thoughts. The adrenaline was still running through his veins, but the pain in his shoulder reminded him that he wasn't invincible. He needed medical attention, but he couldn't afford to stop yet. Lisa's voice crackled through the earpiece once more, and Clint's pulse quickened. "Clint, are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm out," Clint replied, his voice strained. "For now, I'm heading toward the coast. I'll be off the grid for a while. Can you meet me at the rendezvous point?" There was a long pause before Lisa responded, her voice steady but still laced with concern. "You know we're just getting started, right?" Clint stared out over the water, the dark horizon stretching before him. The events of the past few hours, the danger, the lies, it all swirled in his mind like a storm. Ames's reach was vast, his influence insidious. It was more than Clint had ever anticipated. But one thing was clear. The fight was far from over. "I know," Clint said quietly, "but it's not over yet. We'll stop him, Lisa. We have to." The boat slowly made its way toward the shore, and Clint's mind drifted back to the events of the night. In the chaos, he'd learned more than just the depth of Ames's treachery. He'd realized something about himself. For so long, Clint had been focused on duty, on the mission. He'd let his allegiance to the CIA, to his country, define him. But in that moment, as the world around him collapsed, he understood something deeper. It was the people he fought for, the ones who couldn't protect themselves, who truly mattered. His loyalty didn't belong to an organization. It belonged to the truth, to justice. It was a turning point for Clint, a realization that the stakes of this fight were not just about survival or power. It was about protecting what was right. Ames had tried to corrupt that, to twist Clint's sense of duty into something monstrous. But Clint wasn't about to let that happen. As the boat crept closer to land, Clint's thoughts hardened into a singular truth. He had no intention of letting Ames win. Not now. Not ever. The dawn was just breaking as Clint docked the boat on the remote beach. The water lapped gently against the hull, the only sound in the stillness of the morning. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and violence that had defined the past few hours. Clint stepped out of the boat, wincing as his injured shoulder protested the movement. His hand instinctively reached for his side, feeling the dampness of blood against his shirt. He needed to stop and patch himself up, but he couldn't afford to. Not yet. The rendezvous point Lisa had mentioned was a few miles inland, a secluded cabin in the woods where they had hidden out during previous operations. It was off the grid, surrounded by dense forest and miles away from the nearest road. If anyone were tracking them, it would be hard for them to get close without being noticed. Clint took a moment to breathe, his body sore and exhausted, but the urgency of the situation pushed him forward. The night's events had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Ames's manipulations had run deeper than Clint had ever imagined, and he was only just beginning to understand the full extent of the conspiracy he had stumbled into. He wasn't just up against a rogue agent. He was up against a shadowy network that spanned across countries, governments, and intelligence agencies. And that made him more dangerous than ever. As Clint made his way through the thick underbrush toward the cabin, his thoughts drifted to Lisa. She had been with him every step of the way, through the most dangerous moments of his career. There was no one else he trusted more, but even so, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were still in the dark. Lisa had her secrets, too. Secrets that might come to light at the worst possible time. The betrayal from Ames had shaken Clint's trust in everyone. He'd always believed that the people closest to him were the ones he could rely on, but now that belief was eroding. If Lisa had her own agenda, he couldn't afford to ignore it. She had never given him any reason to doubt her loyalty, but in a world filled with deception, no one could be trusted completely. The cabin loomed in the distance, nestled among the trees like a forgotten relic of a different time. Clint pushed the door open and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar smell of dust and wood. It was small, functional, nothing more than a safe house, but it was enough. He didn't need luxury. He needed a place to regroup and figure out their next move. Lisa was already there, waiting for him. She stood by the window, her back to him as she stared out into the forest. Her posture was tense, her shoulders stiff with the weight of their situation. Clint could see the concern in her eyes as she turned to face him, her gaze flicking to his injured shoulder before meeting his eyes. "You're bleeding," she said quietly, stepping forward. "You need to take care of that." Clint shook his head, ignoring the pain. "Later. We need to talk." Lisa hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, her expression hardening. "About what?" Clint took a seat at the small wooden table in the corner of the room, his hands still pressed against his wound. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken questions and doubts. He needed answers. Answers about Ames, about the conspiracy, and most importantly about Lisa herself. But where to start? "I don't know what's going on anymore," Clint said, his voice low. "I don't know who I can trust. I thought I knew what I was up against, but Ames, he's just the tip of the iceberg. There's something bigger here, something we don't understand." Lisa crossed the room slowly, her eyes never leaving Clint. "You're right. We don't know the full picture, but we're getting closer. I've been tracking some of Ames's contacts, and I found something. Something that could explain why he's been after you." Clint looked up, his interest piqued despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. "What is it?" Lisa pulled out a folder from her bag and dropped it onto the table. She opened it carefully, revealing a series of photos, documents, and encrypted files. The pages were marked with familiar logos: CIA, NSA, military intel, but there were also unfamiliar symbols. Blacked-out names, heavily redacted files. It was clear that whoever had created this dossier didn't want anyone to know what was inside. "Look at this," Lisa said, pointing to a photo of a group of men standing in front of a nondescript building. "These are the people Ames was working with. They're not just rogue agents, Clint. They're tied to something much bigger." Clint leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. The names and faces were mostly unfamiliar, but one name caught his eye: Viktor Arkadyev, a former KGB officer who had gone dark after the fall of the Soviet Union. There were whispers about his involvement in black market arms deals, but until now, no one had been able to confirm his whereabouts. "Arkadyev?" Clint asked, his voice edged with disbelief. "You think he's involved in all this?" Lisa nodded grimly. "Ames isn't working alone. Arkadyev is one of the key players in a network that's been orchestrating operations across the globe. They've been manipulating governments, funding terrorist organizations, and controlling global intelligence agencies. Ames is just a small part of it, but he's connected to Arkadyev. If we can get to Arkadyev, we might be able to stop this whole thing." Clint sat back, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The conspiracy was even larger than he had feared. Ames had been a pawn, just like Clint had been, and Arkadyev was the mastermind behind it all. The realization hit Clint like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about stopping a rogue agent. This was about taking down an entire criminal syndicate that threatened the stability of nations. "We need to find him," Clint said, his voice hardening with determination. "We need to stop Arkadyev before he does any more damage." Lisa nodded. I'm with you. But we have to be careful. Arkadyev is dangerous, and he's not going to be easy to track down. We'll need more resources, more intel, and we'll have to move fast. Clint stood up, his jaw set. Then we don't waste time. The air in the small cabin grew thick with the weight of their conversation. The silence that followed Clint's declaration felt like an electric charge hanging in the room, one that could snap at any moment. Lisa's expression was unreadable as she processed the gravity of what had just been laid out before them. The stakes had reached a new level, and they both understood that there was no turning back. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm, one that had been brewing for years. This wasn't just a matter of taking down one bad player. This was a global conspiracy that had ensnared governments, spies, and shadow organizations. And the one person standing between them and the collapse of everything they knew was Arkadyev. A man whose name had been whispered with fear, but whose true power had remained a mystery. But now, with the pieces falling into place, Clint knew that the only way to stop Arkadyev was to expose him. Every fiber of his being told him that the only path forward was one of confrontation and infiltration. There was no other choice. They couldn't just sit back and let the conspiracy unfold. We need to find out where he is, and we need to move fast, Clint said, his tone decisive. But we can't do it alone. Lisa shifted uneasily, crossing her arms. Who do you think we can trust? The CIA's compromised. Whoever's been covering up this network has people in high places. We're essentially walking into a nest of vipers. If Arkadyev's the mastermind, we have to assume he's got eyes everywhere. Clint nodded grimly. He'd already considered this. The web they were tangled in was more complex than they had originally realized. It wasn't just about bringing down a single individual anymore. It was about taking on an entire system, one that had been silently controlling the world's power structures for years. We need outside help, Clint said after a pause. People who aren't connected to the CIA, people who haven't been compromised. Lisa's eyes narrowed. You mean, the kind of help we're usually sent to take down? Clint met her gaze, a flash of determination in his eyes. Yes, the people who know how to operate outside the system. I have a few contacts. If we can bring them in, we can set a trap for Arkadyev. But it's risky. If he's got as many allies as we think he does, we won't just be facing one enemy. We'll be facing everyone. Lisa let out a soft breath, clearly weighing the dangerous proposition. But in the end, Clint could see the acceptance in her eyes. She knew they didn't have a choice. They had to move fast, and they needed allies in places the CIA couldn't reach. All right, Lisa said, her voice resolute. Let's do it. But Clint, we need to talk about something before we move forward. Clint raised an eyebrow, sensing the hesitation in her voice. What's on your mind? Lisa shifted her weight, her face drawn in concentration. You're pushing yourself too hard. You're injured. You need to rest. Clint looked at her, his expression hardening. I can't afford to rest, Lisa. Arkadyev won't stop until he's crushed us, and I won't let him do that. Not after everything we've been through. I get it, she replied, her voice softer now. But you can't do this if you're broken. We've lost enough already. If you go down, then we're both done. Clint's jaw tightened, the familiar edge of defiance rising in him. He wasn't used to people telling him what he could and couldn't do. But something about Lisa's words hit him differently. She was right. He wasn't invincible. And if he didn't take care of himself, this fight would be over before it even started. With a sigh, Clint reluctantly conceded. Fine, but not for long. We'll head to the safe house first. I'll get patched up. Then we move. Lisa gave him a sharp nod and began gathering her things. Clint, though, stayed at the window for a long moment, staring out into the horizon. His thoughts were racing. The danger was closing in, and every second that passed brought them closer to Arkadyev, to the confrontation they had been building toward. But as the morning sun rose over the trees, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. A few hours later, Clint and Lisa were on the move again, this time driving down a winding, dirt road that cut through a dense forest. Clint kept his hand firmly on the wheel, the hum of the engine the only sound in the vehicle. The world outside the car was a blur of trees and shadows, but inside, Clint's mind was razor-sharp, focused on the task ahead. They were heading to one of Clint's old contacts, someone who had been on the fringes of the intelligence world for years. She wasn't an ally in the traditional sense, but she was someone who knew how to get things done without the red tape of government oversight. In this line of work, those were the kinds of people Clint trusted the most. As they drove, Clint's mind shifted back to Arkadiev. The man was a ghost, never in one place for too long, always one step ahead. The intel they had was scarce, but Clint knew that Arkadiev's network was far-reaching, and he had eyes everywhere. The harder they pushed, the more they risked being exposed. "Lisa," Clint said, breaking the silence, "do you ever wonder how we got here? I mean, we used to believe in something, in what we were doing." Lisa looked over at him, her expression thoughtful. "I've always believed in the mission, but I don't know anymore. I don't know who's pulling the strings, or what's real." Clint sighed, a heavy weight pressing down on him. "I thought I knew too. I thought the CIA was the good guys. But the more I dig into this, the more I realize how deep the corruption runs." Lisa's voice softened. "Sometimes you can't fix the system from the inside. Maybe that's why we have to fight outside it." Clint's lips twitched into a brief smile. "Maybe." The dirt road opened up into a small clearing, and Clint pulled up in front of a modest cabin hidden among the trees. The place was isolated, a perfect spot for someone who needed to remain off the radar. As Clint and Lisa stepped out of the car, a figure emerged from the cabin. A tall woman with dark hair and a stern look in her eyes. She wore tactical gear, her demeanor as sharp as her gaze. "Clint," she said, her voice low but steady. "I figured you'd come knocking sooner or later. You're in deep, huh?" Clint nodded. "You don't know the half of it, Rebecca." Rebecca glanced at Lisa and then back to Clint. "This won't be easy. Arkadiev has eyes everywhere. If we're going after him, we need to move fast and be smarter than ever." Clint turned to Lisa, his gaze unwavering. "We're ready." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "All right, let's get started. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" The cabin was quiet when Clint, Lisa, and Rebecca sat around the worn wooden table, the only light coming from an old oil lamp flickering softly in the corner. Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the documents that Rebecca had laid out in front of him. The air in the room felt dense, charged with the weight of their next steps. The walls seemed to close in as the reality of their situation sank deeper. They were about to plunge into a dangerous web of deception, and the stakes had never been higher. Rebecca had quickly proven to be the kind of person Clint could rely on when things got tough. She wasn't a government agent, but she had connections. Too many connections, some of which Clint wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know about. The world they were stepping into was one of shadows, where no one was exactly who they seemed. Rebecca's network was as vast as it was mysterious. She had eyes and ears everywhere. Smugglers, hackers, mercenaries, and the occasional rogue government agent willing to bend the rules for the right price. Clint trusted her because she was one of the few people who knew how to play the game without getting caught in it. She was a ghost, and in this world, ghosts didn't leave fingerprints. "We're looking at a bigger picture than I think you both realize," Rebecca said, pulling out a map dotted with red circles and connected lines. "The network runs deeper than just Arkadiev. He's one of many players, powerful, but not the only one." Clint leaned in, his brow furrowing. "Who else is involved?" Rebecca pointed to several names and locations marked on the map. "This is a global operation. Arkadiev controls certain assets in Europe, but there are other key figures, people with influence in Asia, the Middle East, and even Latin America. They're all working in the shadows, controlling everything from arms deals to cyber warfare. Arkadiev's just the link between them all." Lisa's expression darkened. "So, he's the linchpin? If we take him out, we take the whole thing down?" Rebecca shook her head. "It's not that simple. Arkadiev is essential to the operation, but there's a bigger puppet master. The real question is who is pulling his strings." Clint's mind raced. "You mean to say there's someone above him? Someone we haven't even touched yet?" Rebecca nodded, her eyes flickering with a mixture of frustration and determination. "Exactly. And that's why we need to hit Arkadiev hard and fast. Take him out of the equation, and the rest of the network will fall into disarray. But we need to do it strategically. We need leverage, and we need to move quickly before they can figure out what we're up to. Clint stood up, pacing around the room. His thoughts were like a whirlwind, spiraling out of control. The path to Arkadiev was fraught with danger, but if there was a chance to take down the entire network, it was worth every risk. We'll need to isolate him, Clint said, more to himself than anyone else. Cut off his connections, and then we find the one thing he won't be able to survive without. Rebecca smiled faintly. I was hoping you'd say that. I've got a lead. One of Arkadiev's key contacts is a hacker, someone who's been tracking his communications for months. She's been working under the radar, but she's scared. She's been feeding intel to the wrong people. Lisa looked up, interest piqued. Where do we find her? She's hiding out in a remote town in Eastern Europe, Rebecca answered. I've arranged for a meet, but you're going to have to move fast. If Arkadiev suspects anything, she'll disappear. No one escapes him once they're in his sights. Clint felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was it, the first real break they'd had since the beginning of this whole mess. The chance to pull the thread that could unravel the entire operation. We'll leave tonight, Clint said decisively. Get the intel, and then we hit Arkadiev hard. By the time they set off, night had fallen, and the world outside the cabin had descended into darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels as the car bounced along the gravel road, heading toward the remote airstrip where a small private plane awaited. Rebecca's connections had already arranged everything. Flights, transportation, safe houses, everything they needed to move quickly without drawing attention. As they boarded the plane, Clint took one last look at the cabin they were leaving behind. This mission was no longer just about survival. It had become a race against time. A race to stop Arkadiev before he could destroy everything they had worked for. And Clint knew that they weren't just fighting for their own lives anymore. They were fighting for the future of the world. The plane took off into the cold night sky, the city lights below fading into the distance. Clint's thoughts were 1,000 miles away, focused entirely on what lay ahead. The storm was coming, and they were heading straight into its eye. Hours later, the plane touched down in the outskirts of a small town in Eastern Europe. The chill of the night air hit Clint as he stepped out of the plane, the fog swirling around them like a blanket of secrecy. They were in enemy territory now. Every step they took could be their last. Rebecca led them to a secluded safe house, a dilapidated building tucked between two ancient stone walls. The place looked abandoned, but Clint knew better. It was a trap, a controlled environment designed to keep them safe while they met with the hacker. Rebecca's network had eyes on everything, and she was taking no chances. Clint looked at Lisa as they entered the building. Her face was set in determination, but Clint could see the undercurrent of fear in her eyes. They were moving deeper into enemy territory with every step. One wrong move, and Arkadiev's network would be on them in an instant. As they settled in and waited for the hacker to arrive, Clint's mind raced. There was no time to waste. If they couldn't get the information they needed from the hacker, everything they had done so far would have been for nothing. This was the moment they had been building toward, the point of no return. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. A woman, her face hidden beneath a hood, her movements cautious and deliberate. She looked around, as if scanning for danger, before she finally spoke in a low voice. "You Clint Eastwood?" she asked, her accent thick with the weight of her secretive life. Clint nodded. "That's me. You got what we need." The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as though she feared someone might be watching. "I can get you the intel, but it's going to cost you." Clint's heart rate quickened. They didn't have time for negotiations, but he had no choice. "What's your price?" The woman looked him straight in the eye. "Protection. From Arkadiev. You get me out of this alive, and I'll give you everything." Clint locked eyes with Lisa, who nodded in silent agreement. They had no choice. Arkadiev's network was vast, and the hacker was their key to bringing him down. But they would need to tread carefully. One false move, and Arkadiev would have them in his sights. The pieces were falling into place, but the real danger was only just beginning. As they prepared to move forward with the next phase of their plan, the tension in the room thickened. With the hacker's information, They were about to make a move that could shake the foundations of Arkadyev's entire operation. But Clint knew better than anyone that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The storm was coming. The hacker, whose name was Nadia, had provided them with a treasure trove of information, encrypted files, coded messages, and key connections that would allow them to track Arkadyev's every move. But the price was steep. She demanded to be smuggled out of Eastern Europe and given protection from Arkadyev's vast network, a network that had eyes everywhere. It was a bargain Clint didn't love, but it was one they couldn't afford to refuse. As they set up in the safe house, Nadia's nervous energy was palpable. She was still reeling from the pressure of being under Arkadyev's thumb for so long, and the paranoia in her eyes reflected the constant fear that someone would come for her. But there was no turning back now. She had the key to their success, or their failure. "Do you trust her?" Lisa asked in a low voice, sitting across from Clint at the small table. Nadia was in the other room, working through the data they'd retrieved. Clint rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, looking out the window at the fog rolling in from the hills. The town around them seemed eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath. He didn't like the idea of trusting anyone outside of their tight-knit team, but they were desperate. They needed to bring Arkadyev to the ground, and Nadia had the tools to do it. "I trust her as much as I trust anyone in this mess," Clint replied quietly. "She's scared, but she's smart. And if Arkadyev doesn't catch wind of what she's doing, we'll have what we need to hit him where it hurts." Lisa leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "But how long do we have before Arkadyev figures out that Nadia's betrayed him?" "That's the real question," Clint muttered, rubbing his eyes. "We don't have much time. Arkadyev's people are everywhere. The closer we get to exposing him, the tighter the noose gets around our necks." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Nadia entered, holding a thick folder filled with papers and digital drives. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, and for a moment, she hesitated before speaking. "I've cracked it," Nadia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know where he's going. Arkadyev's planning something big. It's not just about arms or cyber warfare this time. He's about to leverage something far worse." Clint stood up immediately, his interest piqued. "What do you mean? What's he planning?" Nadia placed the folder on the table, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside, Clint found a series of decrypted messages, including a set of coordinates and names. The messages were coded in a way that Clint immediately recognized. Arkadyev was planning a high-profile exchange with several government officials from a few different countries. But it wasn't just political leverage. This was something much darker. Nadia pointed to a set of documents. "This is what I've been able to piece together. He's meeting with top officials from 3 different countries. They're talking about exchanging intelligence and resources on a global scale. But they're also making a deal for something else." Clint's eyes narrowed. "What else?" Nadia swallowed hard. "A weapon. A biological weapon." The words hit Clint like a punch to the gut. He didn't have to ask what kind of weapon. He'd heard the rumors of Arkadyev's dealings with bioengineers and underground labs, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. "This is bad," Lisa said, her voice tense. "This is a game changer. If Arkadyev gets his hands on that kind of power, he'll hold the entire world hostage." Clint nodded grimly. "We can't let that happen. Where's the meeting going down?" Nadia quickly pointed to the coordinates on the page. "Here, in a remote location in Russia, a private compound. Arkadyev and his associates will finalize the deal there. They're bringing in the biological agents soon, and once they have them, they'll be unstoppable." Clint clenched his fists. The timing couldn't be worse. Arkadyev was moving forward with a plan that would give him unprecedented control over the world's governments. They had no choice but to act now, before it was too late. "Rebecca," Clint said, his voice steady despite the rising pressure. "We need to get in and stop this. We take the compound, expose Arkadyev and his network, and put a stop to this weapon deal." Rebecca nodded. "I've got a team ready, but this isn't going to be easy. You're talking about infiltrating a compound heavily guarded by his most trusted people. Arkadyev won't just hand over control of that bioweapon without a fight." Clint's expression hardened. "We're ready. We don't have any other options. If we don't take him down now, everything we've fought for will be for nothing." The plan was set into motion faster than Clint had anticipated. By dawn, they were in the air again, heading toward Russia. Nadia's intel had been invaluable, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Arkadiev had to know they were coming. But the thought of waiting, of giving Arkadiev more time to make his move, was too dangerous. They had to strike first. As the plane descended toward the isolated region near the compound, Clint went over the plan once again. They would infiltrate the facility under the cover of darkness, disable the security systems, and gather the evidence needed to expose Arkadiev's global network. The mission was simple in theory. Stop the biological weapon, eliminate Arkadiev, and dismantle the operation. But Clint knew better than anyone that things never went according to plan. The plane landed in a secluded forest clearing, and they immediately moved out. The team, which included Rebecca's mercenary allies, had already prepared their gear. Everyone knew their role. They would go in fast, quiet, and hard. As Clint, Lisa, and Rebecca navigated the dense woods toward the compound, Clint's mind raced. The adrenaline was pumping through his veins, but it didn't numb the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. Arkadiev was a master at this. He would be expecting something like this, and the closer they got to him, the more dangerous it became. They reached the perimeter of the compound under the cover of darkness, the silence in the air almost suffocating. Clint motioned for the team to hold, his fingers instinctively brushing the weapon at his side. They were so close now, but just as they were about to make their move, a voice crackled through the radio, sharp and urgent. "Clint, we've got a problem," Rebecca said, her tone heavy with tension. "They know we're here." Clint froze, his blood running cold. Arkadiev had known they were coming all along. With the compound's security now alerted, the mission had become even more dangerous. Time was running out, and for Clint, there was no turning back. The radio crackled once more, snapping Clint back into the present moment. "Clint, they're mobilizing. The compound's on high alert. You've got minutes before the entire place is locked down," Rebecca's voice rang out, each word laced with urgency. Clint's grip on his weapon tightened. The smooth, calculated mission they had rehearsed for days had shattered in an instant. Arkadiev had anticipated their every move, and now they were walking directly into a trap. He motioned for the team to move faster, adrenaline surging through his veins as they sprinted toward the main building. The night felt colder, darker. Every shadow seemed to stretch out, hiding dangers they couldn't yet see. "Move out," Clint barked, his voice low but commanding. Nadia, the hacker who had given them the intel, was a step behind them, her face pale and panicked. She had been valuable so far, but now, Clint wasn't sure she would survive the chaos they were about to walk into. And even worse, if Arkadiev got his hands on her again, all the information they'd gathered would be lost. Lisa was just ahead of him, her eyes scanning the surroundings, her hand firmly on her weapon. He could tell she was processing every possible escape route in case things went south. Lisa always had a knack for staying calm under pressure, but even she seemed rattled. They knew what was at stake now. The biological weapon, Arkadiev's network, their lives, everything was teetering on the edge. The compound loomed ahead, a cold, imposing structure encircled by high, barbed wire fences, a dozen or more armed guards patrolling the perimeter. As Clint's eyes darted between the guards and the fortified gates, a harsh realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Arkadiev's people were everywhere, and the compound's defenses had been built for a reason. No one had ever expected them to get this far. "Clint, you need to get inside now," Rebecca's voice came through the comms again. "The intel you're looking for is in the central vault, but they're locking everything down. Get in, grab the data, and get out. There's no time left." The vault. Clint nodded, signaling the others to follow him. The mission had changed from an infiltration to a desperate dash for survival. No longer were they playing to win. They were just trying to get out alive. But as they made their way toward the building's entrance, the sound of boots crunching against gravel echoed in the distance. Clint's heart skipped a beat. They weren't the only ones moving in the shadows. "Ambush!" Lisa shouted, her voice sharp with realization. Suddenly, the silence of the compound was shattered as armed guards emerged from the shadows, blocking every possible escape route. Their guns glinted in the dim light, trained directly on Clint and his team. Before Clint could react, the sharp crack of a sniper rifle echoed across the compound. One of Rebecca's mercenaries went down, his body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. The sound was deafening, reverberating through Clint's chest. "We've been set up," Clint roared, ducking behind the nearest wall, pulling Lisa and Nadia down with him. Panic started to rise in Clint's chest as the weight of their situation settled in. There was no way out, no easy path forward. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and caught in a deadly game they hadn't been ready for. Clint's thoughts raced. The plan, everything they had prepared for, was out the window. There was no escape from here, not unless they fought their way through the compound and made it to the vault. "Stay low and follow me," Clint ordered, his voice a firm command despite the chaos. The team was moving on instinct now, every decision based on the raw need to survive. "We get to the vault, we get the intel, and then we make our exit. We move as a unit. No one goes alone." Nadia's face was white, her hand trembling as she clutched her weapon. I didn't think it would go down like this. I thought we'd have time," she stammered, her voice breaking. Clint shot her a quick glance, forcing himself to focus despite the overwhelming pressure. "It's not over yet. Just stay close, and don't stop moving. We're getting out of here, no matter what it takes." The fight that followed was brutal, a blur of gunfire, shouting, and the cacophony of metal clashing with concrete. Clint felt every ounce of his training kicking in as he moved with precision, taking down guards one by one, pushing forward despite the odds. Lisa was a blur beside him, her movements fast, deadly, and efficient, cutting through the enemy lines with ruthless precision. But no matter how many they took down, the guards kept coming, the compound's defenses impenetrable. Clint's heart hammered in his chest as they reached the central building. The vault was just inside, but getting there felt like running through hell. Clint shot a glance at Nadia. "This is it. You're up." Nadia nodded, swallowing hard. She approached the door to the vault with trembling hands, the seconds stretching into an eternity. The digital lock was sophisticated, far more advanced than anything Clint had seen before, but Nadia had the skill. She worked quickly, her fingers flying over the keys, the faint glow of the terminal casting an eerie light on her face. The air felt thick with tension as Clint and Lisa kept watch, their guns aimed at the entrance, ready for any sudden movement. "I'm in," Nadia whispered after what felt like an eternity. "The data's here." Clint's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The moment that could turn the tide. They had the intel, they could expose Arkadiev, and they could stop the weapon from being used. But as he turned to face Nadia, a flash of movement caught his eye. It was too late. The sound of a dozen boots pounding against the floor echoed through the hallway. Arkadiev's men had found them. "No!" Clint shouted, his heart plummeting as he grabbed Nadia and pulled her away from the terminal. But it was already too late. The guards were closing in, guns raised, ready to take them down. And then, from the far end of the hallway, a figure stepped into the light. Clint's heart stopped as the figure's face became clear. Arkadiev himself, standing tall and unscathed, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "You've come so far, Clint," Arkadiev said, his voice cold and mocking. "But this is where your journey ends." Clint's blood ran cold, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going to give up, not now, not when they were so close. "This isn't over," Clint growled, his voice low but filled with determination. "You may have the upper hand now, but you won't win. Not this time." Arkadiev's smirk deepened. "We'll see about that." The walls felt like they were closing in, the sound of footsteps growing louder, the tension palpable. But in the chaos, Clint realized something crucial. This wasn't just about stopping Arkadiev anymore. This was about survival, about protecting everything they had worked for, even if it cost them everything. Clint steeled himself for what was coming. The end was near, but he wasn't backing down. Time seemed to freeze as Arkadiev's presence filled the hallway. His sharp features, cold smile, and the way he stood there so confidently made Clint's blood run even colder. This was the man who had orchestrated countless atrocities, the man responsible for the pain and death of so many, and now he was standing in front of them, in control of the situation. Clint's mind raced, his pulse hammering in his ears. They were so close, too close to give up now. "Don't do it, Clint," Arkadiev said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You've lost. Your little team, your plans, everything. It's over. You're already too late." Clint's fingers tightened around his weapon, and he exchanged a quick glance with Lisa. They both knew what was at stake. The vault was open, the intel was in their hands, but Arkadiev's men were closing in on them from all sides. The biological weapon deal was imminent, and Arkadiev's global network of power and corruption would soon be unstoppable unless they acted fast. But the question wasn't just about how to take him down. It was about surviving the next few moments, about finding a way to turn the tide in their favor before it was too late. "We're not done yet, Arkadiev," Clint said, his voice steady despite the growing chaos around him. "You think this is over? You think you've won? You don't know who you're dealing with." Arkadiev's smirk faltered, just for a moment. His eyes narrowed as Clint spoke, calculating his next move, but the slightest crack in his composure told Clint one important thing. Arkadiev was beginning to doubt. He wasn't as invincible as he thought. There was a crack in his armor, and Clint intended to exploit it. Clint gave Nadia a quick nod. "Now." Nadia's eyes widened in realization, but she acted without hesitation. She pulled out the small device hidden in her jacket and slammed it into the central console. There was a sharp beeping noise. A countdown had started. "You think this will stop me?" Arkadiev hissed, his composure slipping further. Clint didn't respond. He and Lisa quickly moved into position, taking advantage of Arkadiev's distraction. They took out the nearest guards with precision, their movements swift and calculated. Each shot was methodical, driven by the weight of the mission. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the world's future. The countdown from the device began to echo through the hall, a clear signal to both sides that time was running out. "Get to the vault," Clint barked, as the air grew thick with tension. He could feel it now. The stakes had never been higher. They weren't just playing for information anymore. They were playing for the world itself. Arkadiev's eyes flashed with fury as he realized what was happening. "No, you can't do this," he yelled, his voice booming, but Clint didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Arkadiev wasn't just an enemy. He was a force that could obliterate everything. And Clint wasn't going to let him. The seconds ticked by, each one like an eternity. The device was already doing its work, locking down the compound's security systems and opening the back door to the vault's contents. The biological weapon was within reach. The intel they needed was just moments away from being secured. But then, the unexpected happened. A loud explosion rocked the compound, sending debris and dust flying through the air. Clint was thrown off his feet, but he quickly regained his balance, adrenaline coursing through him. The blast came from the other side of the building, and the entire structure seemed to shake in response. "What the hell was that?" Lisa shouted, her voice strained. Clint's eyes darted toward the source of the explosion, his heart racing. This wasn't part of the plan. Whoever had set off that bomb had changed the game entirely. Were Arkadiev's people turning on him, or was this just another desperate attempt to keep Clint from winning? "No time for questions," Clint muttered, looking back at Nadia. "You need to finish the job." Nadia's fingers flew across the terminal, her mind sharp despite the chaos. The countdown continued, but she wasn't fazed. "It's done," she said, her voice steady. "The weapon's been disabled. Arkadiev's network has been exposed. We've got what we need." Clint allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The mission wasn't over yet, but they had taken a critical step towards stopping Arkadiev's dangerous plans. With the weapon disabled and the intel secure, there was still a chance to bring the entire network down. But as they prepared to exit, the compound suddenly felt more suffocating than ever. More guards flooded in from the shadows, their weapons drawn, but Clint wasn't ready to give in. Not when they were so close. "Let's move," he growled, signaling the team. "We've got one shot at this. We get the intel out, we expose everything, and we make sure Arkadiev never hurts anyone again." They pushed forward with relentless determination, taking down more of Arkadiev's men as they went. Each step felt like a victory, each decision a choice to keep fighting, even when everything seemed to be falling apart around them. As they reached the exit, the weight of what they had just accomplished hit Clint like a wave. The data was secured, the weapon was disabled, and Arkadyev's empire had begun to crumble. But there was still one last challenge to face. Arkadyev stood in front of them once more. A last stand for the man who had built his empire on lies, fear, and death. His hands were raised in defeat, but his eyes burned with unrelenting fury. "You've won the battle, Clint," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "But you won't win the war. You'll never stop me. There's always another way." Clint stared at him, his heart steady but his eyes burning with the fire of justice. "No, Arkadyev. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." In that moment, Clint knew the fight wasn't just about stopping Arkadyev. It was about showing the world that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always a way to fight back. That no matter how many enemies there was always hope in the face of chaos. With Arkadyev defeated and his network dismantled, the team made their way to safety. The mission was over, but the weight of what had just happened stayed with Clint. The fight had been long, but they had won. And in the silence that followed, Clint couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He had fought for survival, for justice, and for something more than just revenge. He had fought for a better world. And in that moment, as the quiet of victory settled around him, Clint knew one thing for sure. The world had changed, but so had he. The helicopter's blades cut through the cold night air, the rhythmic thrum vibrating through Clint's body as he sat, staring out into the vast expanse below. The world felt different now, quieter in a way, as though the storm they had just weathered had finally passed. Yet, the weight of the mission, and the lives lost along the way, hung heavily on his mind. Clint's eyes remained fixed on the darkness below. The world was still out there, spinning and shifting, unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded in the shadows. But for him, that chaos had been everything. It had been the difference between life and death, between saving millions of lives or watching them be torn apart by the hands of Arkadyev and his followers. The helicopter ride out of the compound felt like an eternity, though it had only been minutes. Each passing second, each mile between them and the site of their last stand, carried Clint further from the past they had just left behind, but closer to an uncertain future. Lisa, seated across from him, was the first to break the silence. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were softer now, a sense of relief mixed with exhaustion washing over her face. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, but there was something else in her gaze, something that spoke of survival and resilience. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "We stopped him." Clint nodded, though the words felt heavy in his chest. "Yeah, we did. But it's not over. Arkadyev may be gone, but there are others out there. Others who think like he did." His mind flashed back to their last encounter with Arkadyev, the final standoff that had nearly cost them everything. The vault had been breached, the weapon deactivated, but the fight wasn't just about stopping one man. It had been about dismantling an entire system, one that ran deep, far deeper than they had anticipated. "The world may have its peace for now, but this isn't over," Clint continued, his voice low but resolute. "There's still more work to do." Lisa didn't argue. She understood. They all did. The mission had been a victory, but it had also been a reminder of the endless fight that stretched out in front of them. Justice had been served, but it was a fleeting thing, something that had to be protected, nurtured, and fought for every day. Nadia, who had been quiet until now, spoke up, her voice filled with a strange mix of awe and sorrow. "We stopped the weapon, but we've only scratched the surface. Arkadyev wasn't just a rogue agent. He was a piece of something bigger." Clint turned to her, his expression hardening. He knew the truth of her words all too well. There were forces in the world that operated in the shadows, entities with resources and power that could rival even the most formidable government agencies. Arkadyev had been a symptom of something far more dangerous. "We'll keep going," Clint said, his tone unwavering. "We'll find them, one by one, and we'll make sure they can't do this again." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of their shared resolve. They all knew what it meant to face down an enemy that would stop at nothing. They had all stared death in the face and lived to see another day. But none of them were naive enough to think this was the end. As the helicopter soared through the night sky, Clint allowed himself a moment of reflection. This mission, this fight, had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The man who had entered that compound, cold and calculating, had been someone who believed that duty and survival came before everything else. But the man who was leaving it behind had been changed. He had seen the consequences of his actions, the lives altered, the pain caused, and, in some twisted way, he had come to understand what it meant to protect the world, not just with weapons and tactics, but with heart. The team's victory wasn't just about their ability to defeat Arkadyev. It was about the choices they had made, the sacrifices they had accepted, and the bonds they had formed under the most trying of circumstances. They had given everything they had, not for the promise of fame or fortune, but because they knew what was at stake. And Clint had learned, in the most painful way possible, that the fight for justice was never over. It was a battle that required constant vigilance, unyielding courage, and, above all, the willingness to make the hardest choices. As the helicopter dipped lower toward their extraction point, Clint's thoughts turned to the future. They had taken down one of the most dangerous figures in the world, but that was only the beginning. There would be more obstacles, more threats, and more battles. And Clint, with his team at his back, would face each one with the same steely determination that had carried him through the darkness. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was part of something bigger, a force for change, for justice. And as long as there were people like Arkadyev out there, Clint would never stop fighting. "We've got a lot of work to do," Clint said, his voice steady and resolute. As he stepped off the helicopter and into the new world that awaited them, Clint knew this was just the first step. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with unknowns and challenges, but he wasn't afraid. He had a team by his side, a purpose in his heart, and the unshakable belief that no matter what came next, he would keep moving forward. Because that's what it meant to fight for something worth fighting for. The story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the air as Clint sat at the edge of the operations room, the flickering light from the monitors casting an eerie glow on his face. The mission had been a success. Arkadyev was down, and the biological weapon was no longer a threat. But Clint knew better than anyone that this victory was merely the surface of something far deeper, darker, and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Lisa and Nadia sat at the main table, poring over the intel they'd secured from the compound. There was something different in their demeanor now, an edge to their focus that hadn't been there before. They weren't just looking at the data. They were studying it, understanding it. "Clint," Lisa spoke, her voice low but clear. This isn't just about Arkadyev. The intel we got from the compound, it's leading us somewhere else. There's another network, one even more dangerous than Arkadyev's." Clint felt the tension in his chest tighten. How much worse could it be? Arkadyev was a goddamn menace. Nadia glanced up from the screen, her face pale. "This goes beyond Arkadyev. We're talking about global infiltration. High-ranking officials from every country are involved. This is the kind of thing that could destabilize the entire world order." Clint stood up, pacing across the small room. "We took down one monster, and now we're finding out there's a whole damn nest of them." His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He was angry, not just because of what had happened, but because of what they had discovered. Their fight was far from over. "This isn't just about military strategy anymore," Lisa added, scrolling through more documents. "It's political, it's corporate, it's global. If we go public with this now, we might just tear everything down, before we even know who's behind it." Clint's mind raced. Every move they made could have consequences. He knew better than anyone that getting too close to the wrong people could destroy not only their lives but the very fabric of the world's stability. Yet, they couldn't just walk away. They were already too deep in this fight. "Then we go deeper," Clint said, his voice hardening. "We find the strings, and we pull them. We take down every last one of these bastards. But we do it smart. No more recklessness." Lisa met his eyes, a mixture of concern and determination in her gaze. "I'm in. But we need more information. We need to identify who's pulling the strings." Clint took a deep breath, his mind working through the possibilities. "Nadia," Run a deep dive on all the data we've got. I want to know who's involved, who's at the top, and I want to know how we can stop them before they have the chance to mobilize." Nadia nodded without hesitation. "I'll get started immediately." They were all fully aware of the risks. The deeper they went, the more dangerous the road would become. But Clint wasn't one to back down, not when they were so close to unraveling the entire conspiracy. The following days were a blur of hacking, analysis, and covert meetings. Every piece of intel they gathered only led to more questions, more names, more high-ranking officials from across the globe. The trail seemed to wind in an endless circle of deceit, corruption, and power. It wasn't just a rogue operation anymore. It was a global network, one that had been operating under the radar for years, even decades. The world they had known was a facade, held together by the manipulation of those who believed they were untouchable. Clint knew the stakes were higher now. The enemy was hidden in plain sight, walking among the people they were meant to protect. The entire system was compromised. "Clint, you need to see this," Nadia called out one night, her voice urgent. Clint walked over to her desk, where she was hunched over a series of complex documents. His eyes scanned the screen, landing on the name that sent a jolt of disbelief through his veins. "This can't be right," Clint muttered, his eyes narrowing. The name in front of him was a name he knew all too well. A man who had been a friend, a mentor, a key figure in their operations for years. "Are you sure?" Lisa asked, her tone betraying her unease. Nadia nodded. "I'm sure. It's him. We've traced the money, the operations, and it all points to him. He's the one funding this global network. He's the one pulling the strings." Clint stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the revelation crashing over him like a tidal wave. His mentor, someone he had trusted with his life, was the very architect of the conspiracy they were now trying to expose. "What now?" Lisa asked quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. Clint clenched his fists. "We go after him, but we do it carefully. No one can know what we found. If we make a mistake now, it's all over." The room was silent as everyone processed the implications. The mission they had embarked on had just taken an even darker turn. Their trust had been shattered, and now they were up against someone with vast resources and the power to destroy their lives without a second thought. Clint knew that if they were to stop him, they would have to go underground. No more relying on traditional methods. They had to become shadows themselves, blending into the darkness where no one could find them. This wasn't just about saving the world anymore. It was about survival. The team began preparing for the next phase of their mission, operating from the shadows. Clint's mind was focused, calm, and unyielding. He had seen the worst of humanity, but this betrayal cut deeper than anything he had encountered before. His mentor was no longer the man he had looked up to. He was the enemy, and Clint wasn't going to let him win. As the sun set on another day, Clint found himself standing alone on the balcony of their temporary safe house, looking out over the city. It was a world full of lies, deceit, and shadows, and yet, here he was, preparing for the fight of his life. He had to believe that there was still hope, that there was still a chance to make things right. But deep down, he knew this path would not be easy, and it might just cost them everything. But Clint wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. The battle was far from over. The hum of the engine as it sped down the darkened highway was the only sound that seemed to fill the empty night air. Clint sat in the back seat of the SUV, his eyes trained on the road ahead, his mind far away. His heart was heavy, weighed down by the burden of what they were about to do. Tonight, they would confront the man who had been like a father to him, the man who had betrayed everything Clint had believed in. Nadia sat in the front seat, her fingers tapping on the dashboard as she kept her eyes on the GPS. "We're almost there," she said, her voice low. "Just a few miles out." Lisa sat across from Clint, her face grim, her eyes locked onto her tablet as she scrolled through the data they'd collected. "You're sure about this? We have everything we need. We can take him down without exposing ourselves. But it's going to be a tight operation." Clint nodded, his mind sharp despite the weight of the situation. "We don't have a choice. He's going to be expecting us. He'll have everything prepared. That's why we can't be sloppy." Lisa glanced up from the screen, meeting his eyes. I still don't understand how you can be so calm about all of this. This isn't just another mission. Clint's gaze remained steady. I know. This is different. But it's the only way forward. We take him down tonight, or we risk losing everything. We don't get a second chance. The tension in the vehicle was palpable, the team's usual camaraderie replaced by a sense of urgency. Clint had always prided himself on being calm under pressure, but this was different. His mentor wasn't just an enemy. He was the embodiment of every deception Clint had ever believed in, every moral line he had ever crossed. The compound they were heading to wasn't just a hideout. It was a fortress, built into the side of a mountain and heavily fortified. It was the kind of place that screamed untouchable, but Clint had seen enough in his life to know that no place, no matter how secure, was impenetrable. The bigger the target, the harder it was to cover up. Approaching the site, Nadia said, her fingers dancing over the controls, activating the encrypted communication system. I've got a feed on the perimeter. We're going to need to disable their security systems before we can move in. How long until you can get it done? Clint asked. 5 minutes, Nadia answered without hesitation. She'd worked on breaking into systems like these before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just a mission anymore. This was personal. Keep it tight, Clint said, leaning forward in his seat. I want eyes on every single angle. The second we're in, we make it count. No hesitation. They drove in silence, the weight of their decision sinking deeper with each passing mile. As they neared the compound, Clint's thoughts raced. The plan was simple, but it was high risk. They had to move swiftly, disable the security, and find their target before he knew they were there. Minutes later, they pulled up to the outskirts of the compound, the tall metal gates looming ahead. Nadia quickly went to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she hacked into the compound's surveillance system. Got it, she said, her voice tinged with a sense of accomplishment. Surveillance is down. We have a 2-minute window to move before they notice anything's wrong. Clint nodded. Let's go. The team moved with precision, slipping from the vehicle and into the shadows. Clint led the way, his senses on high alert. Every step felt like an eternity, the sound of his own breath loud in his ears. They had come too far to fail now. The compound loomed ahead, a dark fortress against the night sky. Guards were stationed at regular intervals, their eyes scanning the perimeter for any signs of trouble. Clint knew that getting past them undetected would be a challenge, but they had no choice. Nadia signaled to Clint, and he motioned for the team to stay low. They moved through the shadows, making their way to the rear entrance of the compound. Lisa had brought the equipment they needed to breach the security, and Clint's pulse quickened as they approached the door. One wrong move, and the whole operation could fall apart. Lisa worked quickly, her hands steady as she bypassed the security lock. 5 seconds, she muttered under her breath. With a soft click, the door opened, and the team slipped inside, into the belly of the beast. The compound was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the faint rustling of movement in the hallways. Clint's heart raced. Every muscle in his body was on high alert, but he knew that rushing now would be their downfall. They had to stay patient, stay focused. They had to find their target. They moved deeper into the compound, their steps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floors. Clint led the team through a series of narrow corridors, each one darker and more labyrinthine than the last. The sense of unease gnawed at him. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. The weight of betrayal hung over every step they took. Clint paused at a corner, signaling for the team to stop. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning for any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension. He could almost hear the beat of his own heart in his ears. "Do you hear that?" Nadia whispered, her voice tense. Clint strained his ears, listening intently. The sound was faint at first, but then it became clearer, a low murmur of voices. "They're just ahead," Clint said, his voice a whisper of steel. "We're close." They moved forward, their breaths shallow and their movements as silent as possible. The voices grew louder, clearer, until they reached the door to a large conference room. Clint signaled for the team to stay back. He peered around the corner, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of his mentor, sitting at the head of a table surrounded by several high-ranking officials. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. They had made it to the heart of the operation, the heart of the conspiracy that had been unraveling his entire world. But Clint's moment of clarity was short-lived. Before he could make a move, a voice came from behind him, cold and calculating. "I've been expecting you." Clint froze. Clint's heart skipped a beat as the voice rang out from behind him. A chill ran down his spine. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. His mentor, now revealed to be his greatest enemy, had anticipated their every move. Every step, every second had been carefully calculated. They had walked right into his trap. Clint's mind raced. The calm, collected facade he had worked so hard to maintain shattered in that instant. He had trusted this man, believed in him when no one else did. To hear his voice now, mocking him, filled him with a bitterness so deep, it threatened to consume him. "Clint," the voice continued, smooth and taunting. "Did you really think you could take me down so easily? All these years, you've been so blind, haven't you? So eager to be the hero, so desperate to prove yourself." Clint turned slowly, his eyes locking with the man he had once considered a father. Sitting across the room, surrounded by his loyalists, was the same man who had trained him, who had taught him the ways of the world. But now, Clint saw him for what he truly was, a cold, calculating mastermind. "You!" Clint's voice caught in his throat. "How? How could you do this?" The man smiled, a cruel, knowing smile that sent a wave of revulsion through Clint's chest. "I didn't do this, Clint. I became this. I saw the game for what it really was. You were always too idealistic, too naive. You believed in honor, in duty. But there is no such thing in this world. You should have known that by now." Clint took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. His team stood behind him, tense, ready for anything. But Clint knew this was no ordinary confrontation. His mentor was more than just a man. He was an embodiment of everything Clint had fought against, everything he had been betrayed by. "I'll never be like you," Clint said through gritted teeth. "You might have pulled the strings from behind the scenes, but I'm done playing your game. You'll pay for what you've done." The man chuckled, the sound echoing in the silence. "You think this is a game? You're in over your head, Clint. The world is mine to shape, and you, well, you're just a pawn who's outlived his usefulness." At that moment, Clint knew. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was part of a much larger scheme, a plan that spanned continents, governments, and lives. His mentor had been playing a dangerous game, one that had taken everything Clint valued and twisted it beyond recognition. "What have you done?" Clint asked, his voice low and deadly. The man's smile faded, replaced by something darker, something colder. "What have I done? I've reshaped the world in my image. I've created a new order, one where I am the master, and you're nothing but a footnote." Nadia stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This ends tonight." Clint nodded at her. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He couldn't afford to hesitate. This was the final confrontation. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. "Clint, listen to me," the man said, his tone shifting, becoming almost persuasive. "You can still join me. Together, we can control everything. The intelligence community, the media, the governments. We'll have power like no one's ever had before. Think about it. All your ideals, all your sacrifices, they'll mean something, finally. But only if you're willing to make the right choice." Clint shook his head slowly. "No, you've lost me. You've lost everything." The man's eyes darkened. "You don't know what you're rejecting, Clint. You're too blinded by your sense of righteousness to see the truth. You always were." Without warning, the room erupted into chaos. Guards who had been lying in wait emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. Lisa immediately pulled out her gun, her sharp eyes scanning for any movement. Nadia sprinted to the side, taking cover behind a column as she scanned the facility's security systems for any way to disrupt the compound's defenses. Clint's pulse raced, adrenaline flooding his system. This was it. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. He had trained for this his entire life, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of the betrayal, the darkness of his mentor's intentions. Stay sharp, Clint barked, his voice cutting through the panic. We move now. They dove into action. Clint moved fast, taking cover behind a table as bullets whizzed past him. Lisa returned fire, her shots precise and deadly. Nadia hacked into the system, disabling security cameras and activating the alarms to throw the compound into disarray. Every movement felt like an eternity, but Clint stayed focused. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. His mentor's face twisted with rage as he stood, backing away from the table and toward a set of double doors leading deeper into the facility. You really think you can stop me, Clint? You're too late. You're all too late. Clint's blood boiled as he watched the man retreat. The idea of letting him slip away again was unbearable, but he had to stay smart. They were outnumbered, surrounded. They needed a plan. Stay on him, Clint shouted. Do not let him escape. The chase was on. They pursued him through the winding corridors of the compound, the sounds of gunfire and chaos echoing around them. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted down a narrow hallway, his mind focused entirely on one thing: capturing his mentor. He could hear the man's taunts echoing ahead, like a phantom haunting every step he took. The compound seemed to stretch endlessly, a maze designed to disorient and trap them. But Clint wasn't about to let that happen. He had trained for this. He knew how to outthink his enemies, how to use the environment to his advantage. Lisa and Nadia followed close behind, their eyes sharp as they navigated the compound's dark interior. Clint could hear the urgency in their footsteps. This wasn't just a mission, it was personal. This was the end of an era. As they rounded another corner, Clint saw him, his mentor, standing in front of a massive steel door. The man looked back, eyes cold, knowing this was his last chance. You're too late, the man said, his voice calm, almost resigned. This is the end for you, Clint. Clint's eyes narrowed. Not yet. With a swift motion, he lunged forward, tackling his mentor to the ground. The two men struggled, their bodies crashing against the concrete floor. Clint's fists landed in quick succession, each punch driven by years of betrayal, by the lies, by the loss of everything he thought he knew. But as he landed the final blow, the man's hand reached into his jacket, pulling out a detonator. Clint's heart dropped. No, he shouted, realizing what the man was about to do. The man grinned, his finger hovering over the button. Goodbye, Clint. Clint's instincts kicked in, his body moving faster than his thoughts. He grabbed the detonator and wrenched it from the man's hand just in time, throwing it across the room. This ends now, Clint growled. And with that, everything changed. The compound was alive with chaos, the sounds of gunfire and muffled explosions echoing through the hallways. Clint's heart raced, his breath coming in short bursts as he fought to keep his focus. He had his mentor on the ground, but the danger wasn't over. The man's last-ditch attempt to destroy everything they'd worked for had been thwarted, but the truth still eluded Clint. He held his mentor down, pinning him to the floor, the weight of their history crashing over him. His mentor's face, once familiar and reassuring, was now contorted with anger and defeat. Clint's grip tightened. You're done. This ends now. His mentor grinned weakly, blood dripping from his lip. You still don't understand, do you, Clint? Clint's eyes flashed with fury. No more lies. No more games. You're going to tell me everything, right now? The man's chuckle was faint, but it carried a certain bitterness. You think you've won? You have no idea what you've just uncovered, what I've been a part of. This is bigger than you, bigger than any of us. Clint's pulse quickened, a sinking feeling crawling up his spine. The pieces were falling into place, but they didn't add up. What do you mean? This whole time, you've been controlling everything. You've manipulated governments, organizations, lives, for what? The man's eyes darkened, his smile turning into something colder. Power, Clint. Absolute power. What you don't realize is that you've been a tool in a much larger plan. You were always meant to be a part of this. And now it's too late for you. Clint's mind reeled. What was his mentor talking about? What could be so much bigger than everything they had just uncovered? Was this about global control? Was it about a personal vendetta? His questions raced, but he couldn't seem to find an answer that made sense. Nadia approached slowly, her eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" The man's gaze flickered to her, then back to Clint. "You really want to know? The truth is, I was never working alone. I was a part of something much deeper, something the world isn't ready for. You've only scratched the surface." Clint's stomach twisted. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Had everything, his life, his training, his work, been a lie? Had his mentor been working for something far more sinister this whole time? "We were all pawns," the man continued, his voice gaining strength despite his weakened state. "You, me, all of us. The whole intelligence community, CIA, MI6, Mossad. It's all a game of power, manipulation, control. The people pulling the strings are untouchable. They control everything. You'll never defeat them. I was their man on the inside, but even I wasn't in their inner circle." Clint's head swirled. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him, like everything he thought he knew had been shattered. His mind struggled to comprehend what was happening, but the pieces were too far apart. The conspiracy was deeper than anything he could have imagined. Lisa stood beside him, her face tense. "Who are they? Who's pulling the strings?" The man's eyes flickered with a hint of regret, or perhaps it was fear. "You're asking the wrong question, Lisa. The real question is, who are you really working for?" Clint froze. His throat tightened as he realized the magnitude of the situation. "What are you talking about? Do you think the CIA, or any agency, truly has control over everything? Do you think you've been working for the right people? There are powers beyond governments. They control everything. Your entire world is a lie." The man coughed, spitting out blood. "It's too late for you to turn back. You're in this now, and you'll never escape it." Clint's world felt like it was collapsing around him. His life's purpose had always been driven by the idea that he was working for justice, for the greater good. But this man, his mentor, had just exposed the truth. He was a cog in a machine much bigger than he could have imagined. A machine that no one could stop. Nadia's eyes glinted with suspicion. "So you're telling us you were working for someone else the entire time? Who are they?" But the man's lips only curled into a bitter smile. "You'll never know. You can try, but they'll come for you before you get close. There's no escape from them." Clint stepped back, his mind struggling to process the revelation. "You were working for them, weren't you? They had you from the start." The man's smirk deepened. "I was the best. I was their perfect agent. But even I wasn't prepared for the full truth. And neither are you." Clint's thoughts raced, but he couldn't make sense of it. Every instinct told him to press the man for more answers, but something in the back of his mind warned him that this wasn't the time. He could feel the walls closing in. This had to be the end. Nadia turned to Clint, her face hard. "What now?" Clint looked down at his mentor, the man who had shaped him, who had taught him everything he knew. Now, all of it was in question. All of it was a lie. His mentor had been a tool in a game of shadows, a game Clint didn't even fully understand yet. "I don't know," Clint admitted, his voice heavy with disbelief, "but I'll find out. I won't let this go." The man's eyes gleamed with a final flicker of amusement. "You're already too deep, Clint. There's no way out now." Clint stood up, his fists clenched. He had to keep going. For all the lies, for all the betrayal, he had to finish this. He couldn't allow this dark force to control the world. Not while he still had a chance to stop it. "We're not done yet," Clint said, his voice steely with resolve. "You might think you've won, but I'm going to make sure you pay for everything." With one last look at his mentor, Clint turned and walked away, his team following close behind. The next steps were clear. They needed to get out of here, find out who was behind this shadow organization, and stop them before they could cause more damage. The game had just changed, again. And this time, Clint wouldn't let them control the pieces. Clint's mind raced as he made his way through the labyrinthine hallways of the compound. His mentor's cryptic words echoed in his ears. "You're already too deep." For a moment, doubt crept in. But then, he pushed it away, focusing on what was in front of him. His team needed him. The world was still out there, on the brink of collapse. He couldn't afford to falter now. He glanced over his shoulder to see Nadia, Lisa, and the rest of the team keeping pace. Their faces were set in determination, but Clint could see the weight of the moment on each of them. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was personal. It had become a battle against an unseen enemy, one that stretched across nations and systems, far beyond their understanding. "We can't let this end like this," Clint muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched. Nadia, sensing the shift in his demeanor, slowed her pace and caught up to him. "You're thinking about what he said, aren't you?" Clint met her gaze. "Yeah, I don't understand what's going on yet, but he was right about one thing. We're in this too deep to back out, but we have to find the source. Whoever's behind this needs to be stopped." Lisa, walking a few steps ahead, nodded. "We'll find them. We're not going to let this slide. Whatever this game is, we're playing it till the end." Clint couldn't help but admire their resolve. He had brought them into this mission that had become far more than any of them had bargained for, but they stood by him. They would finish it together. The team made their way to the heart of the compound, where the final confrontation awaited. The facility was quieter now, the echo of their footsteps the only sound in the tense silence. As they neared a reinforced steel door at the end of the hall, Clint could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. Whatever awaited them on the other side of that door would determine the fate of everything. Lisa moved to the door's security panel, her fingers flying over the controls. "Give me a second," she muttered as she worked her magic. A soft beep confirmed her success, and the door hissed open. They entered a large, dimly lit room. In the center, a massive digital display flickered, showing a world map with hundreds of interconnected points. It was as if the entire globe was covered in veins, threads of influence running in all directions. Clint's stomach dropped as he took it all in. "This is it," Nadia said, her voice quiet but heavy. "This is what they've been building." A low voice spoke from the shadows, causing Clint's blood to run cold. "Welcome to the endgame." The figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, imposing man wearing a sleek black suit, his face obscured by shadows. His presence alone was enough to send a chill down Clint's spine. "Who the hell are you?" Clint demanded, stepping forward. "You think you can control the world from the shadows? You think you can escape the consequences of everything you've done?" The man stepped into the light, revealing a face Clint never thought he'd see again. A face that had once been a symbol of hope, of strength. But now, it was a mask of cold indifference. It was the face of someone Clint thought he could trust. His own father. Clint froze, disbelief washing over him. "No, it can't be you." His father's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, it's me, Clint. You didn't think you could escape your bloodline, did you?" The words hit Clint like a punch to the gut. Everything he thought he knew, everything he'd worked for, was built on a lie. His own father had been behind it all. The secret organization, the manipulation, the game of power. And Clint had been a pawn, just like his mentor had said. No, this can't be happening," Clint muttered, his voice shaking. He took a step back, as if the ground beneath him might disappear. "You've been pulling the strings this whole time?" His father's expression softened, though the coldness never left his eyes. "I didn't want this for you, Clint. I never wanted you to know the truth. But you always insisted on digging deeper, on questioning everything. And now, look where we are. You could have been one of the most powerful men in the world, Clint. Instead, you're just another enemy to eliminate." Clint's fists clenched, his entire body trembling with fury. He had always known there was something more to his family's legacy. His father's influence had always been too powerful, too silent. But he never could have imagined the extent of the betrayal. His father wasn't just a part of the system. He was the one pulling the strings, the one controlling everything. "This ends now," Clint said, his voice low, dangerous. "You won't control anything anymore." The man laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You're just like your mentor. So idealistic. So naive. You think you can stop this? You think you can just walk away from everything you've been a part of?" Clint's heart pounded in his chest. This was the ultimate showdown. The man who had shaped him, the man he'd looked up to, was now the very enemy he had spent his life fighting. But there was no turning back now. "No," Clint said firmly. "I'm not walking away. I'm ending this. Now." The room erupted in chaos. Suddenly, Clint's father activated the system on the large digital display. Red lights flashed across the room, and alarms began blaring. The map flickered, showing multiple locations around the globe that were now under threat. "You won't stop it, Clint," his father's voice echoed as he retreated toward a control panel. "This world was never meant to be run by the weak. It's time for a new order, and you can either join me or become an obstacle." Clint's mind worked in overdrive. He could see it now, the truth his mentor had hinted at. His father wasn't just running an intelligence network. He was orchestrating a global takeover, a new world order built on deception and control. Lisa and Nadia moved swiftly to intercept the control panel, but Clint knew they couldn't stop his father alone. They needed something more. They needed to finish this, once and for all. In a burst of adrenaline, Clint lunged at his father, knocking him away from the panel. The fight that followed was brutal, a mix of hand-to-hand combat and desperate attempts to reach the controls before it was too late. The sound of fists meeting flesh, the grinding of teeth, it all blurred into one chaotic frenzy. Finally, with one last surge of strength, Clint overpowered his father, slamming him against the wall. His father gasped, winded, his eyes wide with shock. Clint stood over him, breathing heavily, his body shaking with rage and exhaustion. "It's over," Clint whispered, his voice hoarse. "You lose." And with that, he reached for the control panel, shutting down the system that had once seemed so untouchable. The world map flickered once, then went dark. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clint allowed himself to breathe. But as he turned to face his team, he knew this was only the beginning. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The silence in the aftermath of the confrontation was deafening. Clint stood in the middle of the room, his chest heaving as he processed the weight of what had just transpired. His father, the man who had shaped his life and his destiny, now lay incapacitated on the floor, his influence and the dark web of deception he had spun now shattered. The world map was blacked out, a symbol of the end of the power his father had wielded for so long. Nadia and Lisa stood a few steps away, their faces tired but determined, eyes still fixed on the control panel Clint had disabled. They had won, at least for now, but the victory felt hollow. The world was a complicated place, and the battle against this vast, shadowy network was far from over. The magnitude of what they had just uncovered was more than any of them could have imagined. "I can't believe it," Lisa muttered, wiping the sweat from her brow as she approached Clint. "Your father." Clint shook his head slowly, still processing the reality of it all. I never imagined it was him. I thought I was fighting for the right cause all this time. But in the end, I was just another player in a game I didn't fully understand." Nadia, ever the optimist, placed a hand on Clint's shoulder. "But you stopped it. You ended it. You broke the chain." He nodded, but doubt still lingered in his eyes. "I did. But what happens next?" Lisa gave him a hard look. "You don't get to quit now, Clint. You've come this far. The world might have been controlled by people like your father, but there are still good people fighting out there. And you, whether you like it or not, are one of them." Clint exhaled sharply, turning to face his father, who was still struggling to regain his composure on the floor. The man who had once been the center of Clint's world, his mentor, his protector, his father, was now just another casualty of the war for control that had torn through Clint's life. But Clint knew that the real battle wasn't over. It wasn't just about dismantling the network. It was about the world that remained after all the secrets had been exposed, after the truth had been revealed. His father's voice broke through the stillness. "You think you've won, Clint?" His words were bitter, filled with venom. "You've only seen the surface. The people you're fighting aren't the real enemy. There's a deeper game at play here. The ones pulling the strings are far more powerful than you can imagine." Clint turned back to face him, his expression hardening. "I know there's more. I know the world isn't as simple as black and white. But it's a start, and it's my start." His father's eyes gleamed with a mixture of frustration and admiration. "You're too stubborn for your own good, Clint. You won't last long against them. Clint stared down at him. I've already lost too much to let it go now. I'm not walking away. With that, he motioned for Nadia and Lisa to follow him. They left the room without another word, leaving Clint's father behind to deal with the aftermath of his own making. They made their way back to the exit, where the storm outside had finally died down. The compound was quiet now, as if even the earth itself had been exhausted from the chaos that had unfolded within those walls. As they emerged into the open air, Clint took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the mission begin to lift from his shoulders. The dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting the first rays of light on a world that had been plunged into darkness for far too long. "We did it," Nadia said softly, her voice laced with relief. "We actually did it." Clint nodded, but his gaze was distant. "We won this round, but there's so much more we don't know. This organization, my father's network, it didn't just end with him. The real question is, who else is out there? Who else is still controlling things from the shadows?" Lisa stepped up beside him, her face hardening with resolve. "We'll find them. We've come this far. We're not stopping now." Clint turned to face his team, the people who had stood by him through it all. They had sacrificed everything for this fight, and now, despite the victory, the uncertainty loomed large. But Clint wasn't afraid. In fact, for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. "We start fresh," Clint said, his voice steady, "but we stay smart. We move carefully. We figure out who's behind this and take them down one by one." Nadia's lips curled into a grin. "I like the sound of that." The three of them stood there for a long moment, taking in the dawn of a new day. The world was far from perfect, far from safe. But it was their world now, and for the first time in a long while, Clint felt the weight of his purpose settle firmly in his chest. He wasn't just a pawn anymore. He wasn't just the son of a man who had manipulated everything. He was Clint Eastwood, the man who had fought for the truth. And now, it was time to rebuild. Whatever came next, he would be ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?